Go Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. And I got a World War III alert. We got a World War III alert and update. But before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, I know it's a lot of news going around the internet. I know about Sauce getting shot and his artist getting killed. RIP to that young man. But it's been 3 or 4 days before we touched on any revolutionary news and updates, geopolitical information. That's what I built my platform on. And I got to update y'all on exactly what's going on. Now, we warned Trump not to play with Yemen and not to think that the revolutionaries was going to bow down to his threats. Now the big dog, Kim Jong-un, done said, oh, you want to talk tough? You want to tell Iran they can't have nuclear weapons? We got nuclear weapons. Well, why are you forgetting about us? So after what I'm finna show y'all, it's the ultimate humiliation for the U.S. because what Kim is reminding, everything you telling Yemen and Iran and Syria and anybody else in the world not to do, we doing it over here. And we're going to keep doing it. Kim Jong-un done stepped into the Middle East war.
We have a ceasefire on a lot of areas, and so far that's all.
Trump made a terrible mistake.
Just a few days ago, the United States decided to start bombing Yemen, claiming it was all about trying to take out key figures and stopping attacks on ships associated with Israel. But here's the thing. North Korea, which everyone knows is one of America's bitterest enemies, didn't just sit back and watch. They've pulled a move that's left the world practically gobsmacked as we speak. Right after slamming the US for what they called indiscriminate bombings and an outright disregard for international law, the North Koreans did something most people didn't expect. They put their military on high alert over what's kicking off in the Middle East. It wasn't just any old military alert either. We're talking about the immediate activation of their nuclear forces, with orders to be combat ready to respond to what they see as American aggression in West Asia.
Kim say he don't like what he's seeing, the arrogance of Trump. He said, you shook my hand. I thought we wanted peace. I thought you wanted peace. But since you don't want peace, then we're going to get into some of this war that you see. Trump, that was a fool's mistake he made. That was a fool's mistake. I told y'all he trying to bully Yemen because he don't want to fight Iran, can't fight Russia or China, and want to be tough because Putin is tough. Everybody can see that. Well, Kim Jong say he's not finna stand around and watch the U.S. try to bully Yemen. But the crazy part gonna be, they're gonna admit all these. See, they keep saying Iran is sending weapons to Yemen. Iran, they know damn well it's the big dog North Korea who's sending those weapons.
That's not something Pyongyang does lightly. And just to make sure the world knows they're dead serious, their ambassador, Mr. Ma Donghui, who also happens to be their envoy to Egypt, went on record through their state news agency, KCNA. His words were blistering.
They definitely don't want
Washington, he said, was indiscriminately targeting civilians and critical infrastructure using air and naval forces, even throwing an aircraft carrier into the mix. If that's not escalation, I don't know what is. Now, at OMT News, we make it our business to cut through the noise and bring you straightforward, unvarnished analysis of the conflict shaping Palestine, Yemen, and the wider region. The thing is, in a world where the truth is bent and twisted to fit political agendas, we're not here to play along. We don't sugarcoat. We don't pander to anyone. Instead, we dive straight into the mess, call out hypocrisy when we see it, and try to make sense of the complexities others would rather sweep under the rug. But here's the rub. Proper independent reporting like this only survives with your support. If you appreciate unfiltered, balanced conversations, then help us push back against the algorithms and the IDF's online propaganda machine. Like this video, share it, and subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the curve. Now, back to North Korea's response. Mr. Ma wasn't messing about. He made it abundantly clear that, in North Korea's eyes, the US had crossed a line. The military attack by the United States is a violent violation of the UN Charter and international law, and is a blatant infringement on the territorial sovereignty of another country that cannot be justified by any means, he said. I express grave concern about the illegal and reckless military actions by the United States, which is obsessed with realizing geopolitical ambitions, and I strongly condemn and reject them. The truth is, North Korea's relationship with the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansarallah, isn't exactly a new thing. It's been simmering away quietly for years. In fact, on July 29, 2015, a South Korean intelligence official revealed that the Yemenis had purchased around 20 Scud missiles from North Korea. And what happened with those missiles? Well, they were fired straight into Saudi Arabia in retaliation for the Saudi-led coalition's aggression against Yemen. At first, Saudi Arabia thought the missiles were Iranian-made.
Remember George Bush, before he went into Iraq, remember what he went to Iraq for? Weapons of mass destruction. I'll never forget this. While they was talking that shit, that's the year North Korea, anybody can look it up, tested their nuclear weapon. For the first time, they tested it when the U.S. was threatening to go into North Korea. Why you didn't go in, threatening to go into Iraq? Why you didn't go to North Korea? Because they'd already got their ass whooped in the Korean War. That's why it is a North Korea, because they done defeated the U.S. once before. And nuclear weapons assure the reign of the Kim family, you know? But come and find out that they keep trying to bully Iran. That's a mistake. I'm hearing it was some tremors near Iranian nuclear facility. We're going to cover that tomorrow. Iran may have tested a nuclear weapon so they can beat Kim Jong-un and North Korea. They got themselves. But anyway, they've been blaming Iran for everything Yemen do. We've been hearing them. Iran better stop aiding them. Iran better stop. Not once have they said North Korea. And North Korea has been sending them weapons. A lot of their weapons come from North Korea. A lot of their technical know-how came from North Korea. And some of that I didn't know. But it even humiliated. Kim came out and just said, fuck it. I'm going to let the world know, Trump, you a buster. You scared of me. I'm the one doing this. Stop blaming Iran.
But a former North Korean security official eventually confirmed what South Korean intelligence had been saying all along. When it comes to shipping missiles to the Middle East, North Korea's track record is pretty extensive. Iran, Syria, Palestine, you name it. But there's something different about the DPRK's connection to Yemen. Their partnership is one of those peculiar alliances built on a mutual need. North Korea, desperate for foreign currency, found a willing buyer in Yemen, which has been craving weapons to shore up its defenses and deal with all the instability at home. And the timing of North Korea's latest wave of Scud missile shipments to Yemen isn't a coincidence. It's happening partly because Saudi Arabia's been cozying up to South Korea in recent years, especially with their joint efforts against nuclear proliferation. This Saudi-South Korean relationship might look secure for now, but it's on pretty shaky ground if Saudi Arabia ever tries to go nuclear itself. That's a diplomatic powder keg waiting to blow. The military cooperation between North Korea and the Yemeni armed forces has been more than just a casual arms deal here and there. It's been the backbone of their relationship, stretching back to the 1980s, if not earlier. But things really picked up in the 1990s. After Yemen's reunification, the new government was hell-bent on building up its missile forces, especially after the brutal 1994 civil war. And who better to turn to than North Korea, a country with a prolific missile industry churning out Scud-type ballistic missiles known as Hwasong-5 and Hwasong-6. By the mid-1990s, Yemen had been quietly buying up Scud missiles from Pyongyang to both expand and replenish its arsenal. Reports suggest Yemen eventually got hold of both Scud-B and the longer-range Scud-C variants from North Korea, roughly 45 Hwasong-6 Scud-C missiles in total, which have essentially become the cornerstone of Yemen's strategic weaponry. And it wasn't just about buying the hardware. North Korean technical teams were reportedly present in Yemen during that period. According to a former North Korean security official who later defected, missile engineers from Pyongyang were sent to Yemen to help install and operate these systems. North Korea also allegedly trained Yemeni military personnel to handle this equipment properly. It was the sort of military assistance that filled the void left by the collapse of Soviet support after the Cold War. And for Pyongyang, it provided a much-needed injection of hard...
They blaming Iran for Yemen having hypersonic missiles. Absolutely not. They know it came from North Korea. They just scared of North Korea.
Currency. One of the biggest moments in this shady arms trade history was the infamous December 2002 So-San incident. This dodgy shipment had 15 fully assembled Scud missiles, North Korean Hwasong missiles, along with conventional warheads and oxidizers, all being shipped on a rickety old freighter. It was like a floating advertisement for North Korea's military exports. When the shipment got intercepted, it was confirmation of what many had suspected for years. North Korea had become a crucial supplier of ballistic missiles to Yemen's arsenal. Even though Yemen officially claimed it would stop purchasing weapons from North Korea after the 2002 So-San shipment scandal, the reality is that by then, the damage, or the strategic benefit from Yemen's perspective, was already done. By the early 2000s, Yemen had managed to secure multiple shipments of missiles and launchers from North Korea throughout the 1990s. And here's a key detail most people miss. During the brutal 1994 civil war in Yemen, both warring factions were already firing Scud missiles, some possibly from older stockpiles. But after the war, the rush to restock was mostly handled through deals with Pyongyang. Fast forward to 2014-2015, when the Yemeni armed forces aligned with Ansarallah took over Sana'a. Suddenly, they had the keys to the kingdom, or rather, the keys to a sizable missile arsenal that had been built up thanks to years of North Korean shipments. This cache included Scud-B and Scud-C missiles, along with their launchers, all waiting to be repurposed in a new and far more devastating conflict. The thing is, missiles weren't the only thing North Korea had been quietly dealing out over the years. While specifics are hard to come by, and let's face it, with secret arms deals, they usually are, various UN sanctions reports and bits of intelligence hint at North Korea peddling a broader array of conventional weapons to Yemen. It wasn't just big-ticket items like ballistic missiles. We're talking about small arms, ammunition, and possibly anti-tank or air defense systems finding their way into the Yemeni market. A confidential UN report from 2018 made a particularly interesting revelation. It found that North Korea's notorious trading arms companies, like Comid, were actively trying to sell light weapons and military equipment to the Yemeni armed forces. They weren't exactly being subtle about it either. The report suggested that North Korea was working through middlemen, using third-party countries to mask the origin of the shipments and slip past detection. It's the sort of shady operation you'd expect from Pyongyang, which has been dodging sanctions for decades. There are also older accounts suggesting that North Korean advisors may have been on the ground training Yemeni elite units, much like they've done in other countries such as Syria and Angola. While there isn't a mountain of hard evidence proving this, the possibility that North Korean instructors were offering their expertise is hard to dismiss given Pyongyang's historical tendency to send trainers abroad as part of its arms deals. More recently, though, the relationship between North Korea and the Yemeni armed forces has been much more about covert support. Even as the Saudi-led coalition's intervention in Yemen began in 2015, North Korean weapons were making their presence felt on the battlefield. According to various sources, including South Korean intelligence and UN expert panels, North Korean-made weapons started popping up in the hands of Yemeni fighters. Remember those 20 Scud missiles Yemen supposedly bought from North Korea back in the early 2000s? Well, when the Saudi coalition started pounding Yemen, those missiles were fired right back at Saudi Arabia. And it wasn't a one-off event either. The Yemeni armed forces continued launching Scud-B and Scud-C variants throughout 2016 and 2017, which they'd locally rebranded as Burkan 1 missiles after modifications. The UN panel of experts on Yemen even got their hands on some of the missile fragments from those attacks. After technical analysis, they concluded that the pieces matched North Korea's Hwasong-6 Scud-C designs, which only further reinforced the idea that North Korean hardware was making its way onto the Yemeni battlefield. The fact that North Korea had essentially become an arms supplier to a non-state actor fighting a US-backed coalition, whether they intended it that way or not, is a fascinating and troubling development. And it's not just about the ballistic missiles either. Reports from the UN panel of experts on North Korea in 2018 showed Pyongyang hadn't stopped its military exports, despite all the sanctions being thrown at it. They found evidence of attempts to sell machine guns, RPGs, and even surface-to-air missiles to the Yemeni armed forces. How were they planning to pull that off? Well, it's a tangled web of intermediaries and front companies. North Korean officials were negotiating through arms brokers operating out of Syria and Iran, using the chaos of regional conflicts as cover to disguise the true origin of their shipments. According to a 2019 UN investigation, some shipments of small arms bound for Yemen were being arranged through a Syrian arms broker network. It's all very cloak and dagger stuff, but if you think about it, it's precisely the kind of shady arrangement North Korea would use to keep the cash flow coming. Not all of these deals have gone through, of course. Plenty of them have been thwarted by international interdiction efforts and sanctions enforcement. But it's believed that at least some amount of North Korean-made weapons, like rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and even anti-tank missiles, have ended up in the hands of the Yemeni armed forces. The US State Department, for one, has accused North Korea of directly arming the Yemeni fighters, even suggesting that Korean People's Army, KPA, weapons have been found alongside Iranian arms in Yemen. It's worth noting, though, that the economic relationship between North Korea and Yemen has never been all that deep. Neither of them has much of an economy to speak of outside of their respective military-industrial complexes. For Pyongyang, Yemen wasn't really a trading partner, so much as a customer willing to pay for weapons. Meanwhile, Yemen's own exports, like crude oil and agricultural products, have rarely found their way to North Korea. But despite the shallow economic ties, the military cooperation between them has been anything but casual. When the Yemeni armed forces took over the capital and seized the missile units of the Yemeni army, they essentially inherited a stockpile of North Korean manufactured weapons. Those weapons included North Korean variants of the Scud missile family, namely Hwasong-5, Scud-B, and Hwasong-6, Scud-C models that Yemen had bought way back in the 1990s. The rebranding of these weapons is interesting too. Take the Birkin-1 missile, for instance. Unveiled by the Yemeni armed forces in 2016, it's essentially a modified Scud-B, a design that can trace its origins to North Korea and even earlier Soviet technology. When reports came out in July 2015 that Yemeni forces had fired Scud-C missiles at Saudi Arabia, South Korean intelligence quickly assessed that these were part of the same batch North Korea had sold to Yemen around 2002. What's more, the Birkin-2H missile, which has enough range to hit Riyadh and beyond, is believed to be based on the Iranian Qiam-1 design, itself a derivative of North Korea's Scud-C expertise. So, when the Yemeni armed forces launch a Birkin-2H, they're essentially deploying technology with a North Korean pedigree, modified and enhanced through Iran's adaptations. And it's not just missiles. UN reports have indicated that North Korea has also tried to send other weapons like machine guns, RPGs, and possibly even portable anti-air missiles to the Yemeni armed forces. One particular UN report from 2019 suggested North Korea was actively trying to supply these weapons through traffickers in Syria. It's pretty clear that while North Korea's support to the Yemeni armed forces is primarily focused on missiles, they've never been shy about broadening their supply if the opportunity presents itself. And here's the thing. While it's all about the missiles for the most part, there's credible speculation that North Korea might have tried offering other kinds of tech to the Yemenis. We're talking about sensor or radar technology, maybe even battlefield radars or communication equipment. North Korea does have a knack for producing these items through front companies like Glocom. But, to be fair, if any deliveries were made in this category, the details haven't exactly been plastered all over the news. Now, when it comes to strategic and technical support, North Korea's style is very different from what you'd see with Iran. Unlike the Iranians, Pyongyang hasn't been sending military advisors to Yemen to actively guide the Yemeni armed forces on the battlefield. There haven't been reports of North Korean officers working directly with the Yemeni fighters in the same way Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, or Lebanese Hezbollah personnel have been documented doing. Instead, North Korea's support is much more indirect. It's mainly about providing hardware and possibly training materials. The training itself likely happened long before the current phase of the war kicked off in 2015. What's probably happening now is that the Yemeni fighters are drawing on skills that were originally taught to the Yemeni military personnel years ago, when North Korean instructors were actively involved in training them. When you hear about the Yemeni fighters firing off a Scud missile or even operating drones, there's a decent chance they're using knowledge that was originally imparted by North Korean trainers back when things were a lot quieter in Yemen. Another thing worth noting is that North Korea has been pretty open to sharing its expertise on missile upgrades. For example, when you hear about the increased range of some of the missiles being fired by the Yemenis, it's possible those modifications have something to do with North Korean engineering know-how. It could be tweaks related to missile fuel technology, or even adjustments to the airframe. Of course, Iran's been heavily involved in this area as well, so it's likely that if North Korea is offering technical advice, it's probably doing so through Iran rather than having a direct line of communication with the Yemeni fighters themselves. But Pyongyang's support isn't just limited to weapons and technology. They've also been pretty vocal in their diplomatic and propaganda backing. North Korea consistently votes against UN resolutions critical of the Yemeni fighters or Iran's role in the Yemeni conflict. And if you listen to what North Korean officials say at international forums, they're basically echoing Iran's talking points, blaming the humanitarian disaster in Yemen entirely on Saudi-led bombings and blockades. This rhetorical support might not mean much on a practical level, but it does help reinforce the political narrative of the Yemeni fighters as part of some broader anti-imperialist struggle. The bottom line is that while the direct connection between North Korea and the Yemeni armed forces is heavily constrained by logistical difficulties and international scrutiny, the Yemeni fighters are still benefiting from what you might call the legacy of North Korean support. That means the missiles, training, and maybe even some of the technical expertise North Korea provided years ago are still very much part of the equation. And despite all the sanctions and enforcement efforts aimed at curbing North Korea's arms exports, it's clear Pyongyang hasn't given up on trying to use the Yemeni conflict as both a revenue stream and a way to stick it to the United States and its Saudi allies in the Middle East. They're always looking for ways to exploit regional conflicts to their advantage, and the war in Yemen is no exception.
Acts of mass murder against the people of Yemen over these last few days, night after night, raining down fire, death and destruction from shot and shell, from the air and from the sea. Netanyahu has entered what he described, or what was helpfully described for him by what passes for the snake screen media here in Western countries, a pinpoint invasion of Gaza, rather like the limited invasion of Rafah that they promised the hapless and semi-comatose Joe Biden last year. But let's start with Yemen. The Yemeni people are the poorest people in the world, but in fact, they are the wealthiest. They are the wealthiest in spirit, in morale, and in integrity. The Yemeni people, way and far away in the Gulf, on the Red Sea, have no need to concern themselves with what's happening in the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian refugee population there, especially when the countries closest to Palestine are arch collaborators, each and every one, including the newest of them, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS-ruled, now not Republic of Syria. When Palestine's neighbors are not only doing nothing, but actively collaborating with the slaughter of their presumed, supposed co-religionists, fellow Arabs, fellow Levantines, you could have forgiven the Yemeni people, who themselves suffered not just poverty, but regime change operation after operation, and a full-scale war, guided, fueled, armed by the most powerful Western countries and carried out by their very own neighbors in the Persian Gulf. You could have forgiven the Yemeni people if they'd said, we'll have to sit this one out. But that's the very last thing that they have done. Alone of all Arab states, all 23 of them, the people of Yemen have stepped up to the plate and done what they consider their national and indeed religious duty, to do everything within their power to come to the aid of the slaughtered, the besieged, the crucified Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And my goodness, what power they turned out to have. Only in the last 48 hours, they landed a ballistic missile called Palestine right in the middle of the Negev desert, on top of the Israeli Air Force's best
They were
and
screaming,
finest
yelling.
planes, men and women. They were on the tarmac. I don't know if you saw the picture. They were assembled in the parade ground for a fly past or a flag waving, flag raising ceremony. And they all had to hit the deck, all 500 of them, lying prostrate on the ground because this missile had come all the way from Yemen. It's a small answer, but it's a much bigger answer than anybody else in the Arab world has been able to deliver. The breach of the ceasefire agreement by Netanyahu is painfully easy to see the rationale for, but none, and I mean none, not one single one of the snake scream media has seen fit to enlighten their viewers or their readers about it. If Netanyahu had not broken the ceasefire, if Netanyahu had not launched a blistering air attack killing 460 people in one single night, 300 of them in one single hour, almost all of them women and children, all over again, Nightmare on Elm Street, back again and again and again. If Netanyahu had not done that on that particular day, he would have had to appear the next day in a court in Tel Aviv to give evidence about his own corruption in his own trial. But
did you hear what George Galloway just said? That was disgusting. When I heard that, that just pissed me off even more. We know he's a bloodthirsty lunatic. If he didn't kill those 400 people that day, then the next day he would have had to show up in court and face charges for his crimes. But since he killed those 400 people, most of them women and kids, and started the war again, they had to set his court date off. That's disgusting. Psychopathic BS. Killed those women and kids so he can miss a court. That's crazy, bro.
But of course, the court hearing had to be postponed because, hey, Israel was at war in Gaza again. If you can't see what's going on here, you clearly are blind, willfully blind, the worst kind of blindness. But the slaughter from the air has, and by the way, also from warships off the coast of Gaza, has now been joined by what the Israeli mouthpiece in Britain, LBC, helpfully described as a pinpoint ground invasion. Pinpoint. With pins. They're going in with pins. And they've got a clear point. Although when we see the casualties from it, they are almost certainly to be the same melancholy, dismal parade of women and children torn to pieces. Some of the video, some of the pictures this week has been extremely painful to watch, probably because, well, we had hoped and prayed that we would not have to look at these things again. Fathers holding their little children stone cold dead. Fathers fondling the pigtails of their little daughters just prior to laying them in the cold earth. The savagery of the barbarians in Israeli uniforms is breathtaking, not just because of the horror that it delivers, but the absolute insouciance with which the world's Western leaders, forever in a paroxysm about Russia and Ukraine, have completely ignored. Not one of them has said one word about the resumption of the slaughter in blatant defiance of the ceasefire agreement, which was solemn and binding, we were told. There's no question about who is to blame. The Palestinians have done nothing but comply in total with their obligations under the ceasefire agreement, which you will recall had the imprimatur, albeit by auto pen, of President Biden of the United States of America. Although it was brokered, we were told, by the peace president, Donald Trump. Donald Trump gave the green light for the slaughter in Gaza the night before last. Of that, there is no doubt. The Israelis said it, and the United States press officer also said it. She endorsed the statement that came out from Tel Aviv that they had been consulted in advance of this mass murder. This mass murder is of a level of the very worst of days over the last year and a half of nightly mass murder. It was not followed by mass murder last night, but it has been followed today by this pinpoint ground invasion, together, of course, with bombardments. The bombardment never stops. I've used the word barbaric and barbarian for two reasons. One, because it is, and second, because the, how shall I put it, academically challenged President of the United States of America, a man who has probably only read one book in his entire life, a man whose only book is The Art of the Deal, has taken routinely to describing the people of Yemen as barbarians. He also called them pirates, though, as my good friend Garland Nixon, who helpfully stood in for me on Wednesday evening, put it, the American people think they're on an ocean liner, but in fact, they're on board a pirate ship. The pirates are you, President Trump. The barbarian is you. That you should imagine that the part of the world that invented mathematics, the part of the world that invented the number zero, the part of the world that invented algebra and geometry, the part of the world that had the world's greatest library when we were living in the woods with our faces painted blue, and your country didn't even exist for 2,000 years afterwards, that you should call them barbarians when it is you who is slaughtering their children in their home when they have never done anything to you. In fact, the United States, throughout the Biden presidency, was bombing Yemen with great regularity. The United States has never done killing Yemenis, but they have still never done anything to you. Their threat was to Israeli shipping, a kind of modern-day armed picket line. Any vehicles, vessels going to or from the country that is committing genocide in Gaza will be intercepted by us, captured if possible, sunk if not. Well, actually, that was the only lawful act that is possible to do in the face of what the ICJ has called genocide. The highest court in the world requires all states to do what Yemen has done. It legally requires every state in the world to do everything that it can to interdict acts of genocide. So actually, the Yemenis are not the brigands, the pirates, least of all the barbarians. They're the only ones in this entire picture who are behaving lawfully, legally. And in any case, they were doing it only to Israel. I know you wanted Canada as your 51st state, or maybe that was Greenland. Is Israel your 51st state, President Trump? Because if not, you told us that you were an America first man. You told us you were going to make America great again. MAGA, you called it, not MIGA, make Israel great again. And if I seem to be preoccupied by Israel on this day that the JFK files have been released, maybe it's because I'm looking, and I've now read 1,000 pages, I'm looking for a needle in a haystack, but I suspect you've already removed the needle from the haystack. And that needle is called Israel. The only thing that has been redacted of note in the entire 80,000 pages is any and all reference to the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad. Now, the reason I know that is because you couldn't even get that right. Because whilst it's redacted throughout within brackets, it isn't redacted at all in several of the early pages. Your redactors missed it. So we now know what the brackets mean. We know what the brackets of that length mean, and they mean the Israeli Secret Service. I cannot say that I myself have yet found or could reasonably conclude that Israel was involved in the Nightmare on Elm Street in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. But I've seen some pretty powerful clues. A man called James Angleton, buried with full military honors
They're not talking about this on the
in Israel, who was the head of counterintelligence operations for decades in the CIA. Ironically, his middle name was Jesus, was an Israeli agent. That much is stated, not even in brackets. It's stated in your own documents that Angleton was an Israeli agent. And we know that he was deeply involved in the run-up to the assassination of President Kennedy, in the building of a casus belli against President Kennedy, particularly Kennedy's determination to thwart Israeli efforts to acquire nuclear weapons entirely illegally, which they continued to hold in profusion, uninspected, not subject to any treaty, not subject to any inspection by the IAEA or the Non-Proliferation Treaty experts. They got that bomb illegally, and they got it thanks to people like James Angleton. And when Kennedy didn't like it and hauled Ben-Gurion to answer for the illegal act of building secretly a nuclear weapon, Angleton and his Israeli controllers determined that President Kennedy had to go one way or another. Sure, they had fertile ground. They did, it seems, have at large an assassin called Lee Harvey Oswald. He was called an assassin in writing by Moscow prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. Yes, that's right. The Soviet Union warned America that Lee Harvey Oswald had purchased a weapon and was going to kill President Kennedy. If only they'd listened to the Soviet Union, which was warning them about the upcoming murder of the best president they ever had. We do know that Lee Harvey Oswald was assassinated in the parking garage of Dallas Police Station by a man called Jack Rubenstein, although for reasons best known to themselves, history records him as Jack Ruby.
Yeah, come on. We know why they would never call him Jack Rubenstein. Are you kidding me? Then that gives everything away.
But he was never Jack Ruby. He was always Jack Rubenstein. a strip club owner that we now know from the release of the files today met with Lee Harvey Oswald only 2 weeks before the crime was committed. It was murder most foul, as Bob Dylan says. It was the beginning of the end of America, as I say. But it's not the only murder most foul that we've been watching and reading about this very week. We've got some cracking guests for you this evening, so you better stay tuned. This is the mother of all.
The new sort of attitude of the Trump administration. Since January 20th, we had the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, between Israel and Hamas. And right now, everything's gone. And what's your understanding of what's going on with the Trump administration?
First, Nima, and I've been saying this all along, but it's become rather stark as I get the real details on it. Israel has not honored a single day of the ceasefire with Lebanon or the ceasefire with Hamas. That's the reality. They have killed, I tried to total it up. It's over 500 people. It's probably much higher than that. They have killed someone in Gaza, in Lebanon, on the West Bank, of course, which is not necessarily included in the ceasefire, but nonetheless, they're still killing people there every single day of the ceasefire. I've asked people, what is ceasefire in Hebrew? What does the Hebrew word for ceasefire mean? Because it's clear Bibi Netanyahu doesn't understand what a ceasefire is. And this has ramifications for Ukraine also, if you think about it for a moment. Putin knows what a ceasefire is. I'm not sure Ukraine and Zelensky do, or the United States, or Europe and NATO. A ceasefire is when you stop shooting at each other and there are forces around that punish you when you continue. Nonetheless, Netanyahu does not recognize that. He's been killing people in Lebanon, killing people in Gaza and everywhere else. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think he ever intended to go to phase 2 or to a second phase of a ceasefire, even though he doesn't honor the ceasefire. So he's back killing people again, and I think he's going to go at it with a vengeance here very shortly. And allegedly, I heard this morning on our news and from sources within the administration that he asked Trump if it was okay to resume the killing, and Trump said sure, because your hostage deal has not happened. The second part of it has not happened. I don't know what that pertained to. Was it the special negotiator who now seems to be disenfranchised? Was it something else that happened? Was it Hamas's strong statement that they wouldn't go any further unless certain conditions were met, like maybe humanitarian aid coming more fully and completely into Gaza? The Nazarene corridor, for example, was an insisted issue with Hamas. I don't know. I don't know what the problem is. I just know that Netanyahu is fulfilling everything I said he would fulfill. He's not ever lived up to the ceasefire in the first phase, and now he's going back to war again. And I'm hearing also, continually hearing, that the IDF is not happy with this, that there are a lot of reservists who aren't showing up, a lot of reservists who said they're not coming to the call, as it were, and that the IDF is going to be strained to go back to war in the way that Netanyahu is ordering them to go back to war, which is essentially a resumption of the first phase of this from October 7th forward. So I can't tell you what is on Netanyahu's mind other than firing the head of Shin Bet and getting into a real mess there. And people telling me from inside Israel that there is a real possibility, a significant possibility that we may have a civil war inside Israel because of the sides that are forming up, and the fact that on the side, even of those people who support Netanyahu, they're not happy with him anymore. They would be happy with the continuation of his policies, but they're not happy with him personally. I don't know whether this has to do with the fact that he's risking so much now to rescue Ben Gvir's element within his coalition, or whether he's just made a lot of people very angry by his attitude about the hostages, which is simply a devil may care attitude, or whether it's just because they see he's been around too long, and maybe this business of getting rid of the head of Shin Bet at a time when it looks like it's more personal than it is political or strategically national security has made people angry. I know it's probably made the Attorney General angry. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. Within the Israeli system, she could really throw a monkey wrench into this if she wants to. Netanyahu seems to think that there's no problem, and basically there shouldn't be a problem. After all, Ronan Bar was head of the Shin Bet when October 7th happened. So he's gotten rid of most of the leaders who were responsible, quote unquote, for October the 7th, except himself, of course, the most responsible of all. So it would be more or less routine, but it's not quite routine because it's so long after October the 7th, and it's so immersed in other very personal issues with regard to Netanyahu. So if I were the Attorney General, I might put my foot down here. And then what happens?
Do you think that Netanyahu was forcing Donald Trump to agree on attacking Gaza again, or he decided by himself and doesn't matter what Donald Trump thinks about it?
I'm totally talked to Trump, and he got permission, and that's understandable because Donald Trump has been unequivocating, I think, on this particular issue. We're looking at a situation where, why did we start up with the Houthis again? Why did we decide that we were going to kill a whole bunch of civilians with regard to Yemen and the Houthis? Well, this goes back a long way. It goes back to my administration, even when the Houthis were born, 1992, I think, and then 94, they got a new leader. And their whole movement was designed to contest the Salafists in Yemen, who really despoiled their holy sites and treated them like dirt. And so, you remember that ruler back there in Sana'a? I remember vividly our first fast rope operation down on a ship. Normally, we would notify the flagging country of the ship before we would do a fast rope operation, helicopters, special forces down on the ship. But we found that every time we notified the flagging country, in most cases Panama, the cargo was thrown overboard. That's to say, we didn't find anything when we got to the ship. So we did one in the South Atlantic, as I recall, on a ship that we had good intelligence on. We didn't tell the flagging country until the moment that the helicopters were over the ship. We found the cargo. We found, as I recall, 5,000 American M16s on that ship. Well, what an imbroglio that created, because as it was filtered through the interagency, we found that those weapons were being sent to this ruler in Sana'a so he could sell them on the black market and make a fortune for himself personally, because the Yemeni armed forces didn't need any more M16s. They were U.S. rifles being shipped to them by us, and we had not coordinated within the interagency group. So this is what U.S. treatment of Yemen has been, at least since that time period, and I suspect before that. So why are we starting to kill them again? Is it all about Iran? No, it's because the military-industrial complex in America, and think about Israel and their resumption and Trump's approval of that resumption of the killing in Gaza, because they go together. The military-industrial complex needs $50 billion a year to feed its maul. It needs that money to keep its shareholders happy and to keep things running like smooth. So why did we start a war and start dropping bombs on Yemen again? Because the military-industrial complex needs $50 billion every year, and it was falling off. Why did Trump approve Netanyahu going back to war? Because the military-industrial complex needs more money. It needs that 50 billion plus every year. That's what we've become. We've become a state that more or less has to be at some kind of war, whether it's bombing the Houthis or whether it's helping Netanyahu or helping Ukraine. We have got to be fueling that complex, funding that complex. We are a perpetual war state. We are a perpetual war state.
Do you think that would bring a direct conflict between Iran and the United States?
That's a different matter, because that's one we'd lose. That's one we would lose badly. I don't know if Donald Trump knows that. I know the Pentagon knows that. I know the people who were there, like C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that he fired, and others that I'm told have been given their walking papers, if not out, at least out of the Pentagon and out of the direct relationship with the president. So is there someone who's going to tell him that if he says, you know, his usual, we're going to rain fire down on Iran? Well, I got news for you, Donald. Iran's going to rain fire down on you if you go to war with them. Now, you can bomb them. And this is what Donald Trump likes to do. Look at the first administration in 2016. He likes to bomb people. He likes to drop bombs on people. He doesn't like to put troops on the ground. He doesn't want to go to war with them in that sense, but he does bomb them. He bombed Syria with what was it, 52 cruise missiles in the very first part of his administration. So he likes to bomb people. And Americans in general like to bomb people, just like Israelis like to bomb people. We bomb with impunity virtually. You don't have to be brave or courageous to bomb people. You just sit in the cockpit. The worst that could happen to you is a maintenance malfunction. You pickle off a few bombs and you kill a bunch of people on the ground. That's the American way of war. That's the Israeli way of war, is not to be vulnerable, but to kill people on the ground. If he tries that with Iran, he's going to find out how ineffective it is. He's going to find out ultimately how ineffective it is. And they're going to make a decision, which they're only maybe a week or two away from making a bomb, to make a bomb. And then we're going to have a real kettle of fish to fry. And if we put troops on the ground in Iran, Nima, count the empire gone. We will dissipate our power. We will absolutely ruin ourselves in Southwest Asia if we go aground to fight the Persians, some 90 million people who are steeled against us if we do that. Not necessarily now, but if we invade them, they will be. And that terrain is nothing like Iraq. That terrain is really tough. I did war planning for that terrain in the late 80s and the early 90s when we thought the Russians might come down there. And I can tell you that's tough terrain to fight in. It almost killed Alexander the Great. It's tough terrain. It's tough temperatures. It's the Zagros Mountains, for example, going through those mountains and with armored columns and so forth. You could lose an entire armored division to just a few guerrillas if you didn't know what you were doing in those mountains. Think of Italy and Greece and the Nazis having to bail them out in World War II when they got all messed up in those mountains. It's really not terrain conducive to American style of war like Iraq was, desert basically. So we'd lose, and it would be a real wake-up call for the empire, but it might turn nuclear too.
Larry, here is what Marco Rubio said in terms of what would be the future of the conflict with Yemenis, Houthis, Ansarullah.
Have these people controlling which ships can go through and which ones cannot. And so your question is, how long will this go on? It will go on until they no longer have the capability to do that.
Then it'll go on forever. It'll go on forever because the Houthis have proven over and over again that they have the capability to keep it going on forever. And we don't have the capability to continue to put aircraft carriers in the Red Sea with escorts sufficient to ward off whatever it is the Houthis might shoot at us and to continue it day in and day out. We are in trouble with people, Nima. People to man our ships, people to man our airplanes, people to man our divisions and brigades in the Army. We are in trouble. We do not have a ready capable military right now. And the Houthis are going to prove that. They're going to prove that. And sooner or later, they're going to get lucky. And they're going to hit an aircraft carrier in a way that is disastrous. What does that mean? What's Donald Trump going to do when there's an aircraft carrier flaming, burning in the Red Sea over Houthis, over the situation that the Houthis are protesting, which is essentially the lack of humanitarian aid going into Gaza and the war in general? And now with Netanyahu picking it up again, the Houthis are going to double down, triple down, quadruple down on what they're doing. And we think that, well, it's not important because they're just, half-ass. They don't really have anything that can damage us. Just keep on trying, keep on doing it, and see what happens.
Fighting Houthis and Yemenis and Ansarullah is nothing new. The United States has a lot of experience in that sort of fight. Actually, they had Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of these Arab states under side to fight Houthis, which didn't end well.
Well, that was Mohammed bin Salman's introduction to warfare. I think he was Minister of Defense, actually. I think he had that portfolio at the time when they started it and they put the coalition together. The only really other formidable member of the coalition, I say formidable with tongue in cheek, Arabs after all. And I'm not saying that derisively. I'm just saying that they're not serious about fighting when they fight. Watch the Saudis when they fly their extended range F-15s and drop bombs that go well beyond the range they're supposed to go and just hit anything because they're no longer guided, because the Saudi pilots are not brave enough to go down and, risk their lives dropping the bombs. And this was U.S. supported, as you said, as you intimated, U.S. supported with intelligence, with the bombs, with the airplanes and such. I actually was told at one point we were furnishing targeting data for them, and we were doing that. And this was what the Pentagon said. We were doing that because they were so inept at it. We had to do it in order to make sure they didn't hit civilians. Well, right after that, they hit a bus with children on it. I think if I remember right, it was about 48 children on that bus, and they killed them. And they picked up one of the residue weapons in the bus, in the carcass of the bus, and it had Raytheon on it. Well, of course it did. So we were there. We were helping them. We have been there. We were helping Saleh when he was president in Sana'a. In 2012, I think they finally ran him out on a rail. But he was the guy that was, contested by the Houthis at that time. And Saudi Arabia got angry about it. And Mohammed bin Salman, I think, thought he would get his bona fides as Minister of Defense, and he would do this little war that would be mostly aerial, and there wouldn't be much to it. And he'd teach the Houthis a lesson. Well, he didn't teach them much. They fell apart almost. Emirates finally backed out of the coalition even because they realized, the little Sparta realized that they were in something that was a little bit above their head. And the Houthis weren't going to be defeated. They're not defeated yet. And now they've got the United States of America against them. And they're still defeated. Thank you very much.
Does the head of Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, know about the history of this fight between the United States and Houthis? Here is what he said, Larry, by the way, on Fox News.
This campaign is about freedom of navigation and restoring deterrence. The minute the Houthis say, we'll stop shooting at your ships, we'll stop shooting at your drones, this campaign will end. But until then, it will be unrelenting. We got the reports last night, Maria. The Houthi capital felt like an earthquake. Dozens and dozens of precision heavy munitions dropping precisely on the targets that we wanted to hit, sending a very clear message. And the message is clear to Iran as well. And the president said it in his truth. Your support of the Houthis needs to end immediately. We will hold you accountable as the sponsor of this proxy. And I echo his statement. We will not be nice about it. This is not the Biden administration. The message is clear. We will come after the Houthis until they stop shooting at our ships, and the Iranians better stay out of it.
Larry, is he talking like the head of Pentagon, the way that he should talk and he should?
He's proving what an amateur he is. Truly, he's proving what an amateur he is, and an ignorant amateur at that. mean, this is a guy who's steeped in what? Special operations, including treating women like they're inferior, special operations and all manner of other things that special operators are noted for. This is a man who is out of his element, utterly out of his element. And he is going to, I won't say he's going to rue those words, because I don't think these kind of people ever rue anything. He's kind of like Netanyahu in that regard. They just go on to their next mess, their next massacre. Hegseth is out of his element, and the Houthis are not going anywhere. And you can bomb them until the cows come home, and they are not going anywhere. You're going to have them on your back from now until the time, as they have said very explicitly, and as they recently demonstrated, there's a ceasefire and the Israelis quit killing Gazans. That's the only thing that's going to stop them.
It's so amazing, Larry, how the Trump administration decided not to go the easy way, which would be convincing Netanyahu to let this humanitarian aid go to Gaza, but instead of that, choosing a new fight and restarting the fight in the Middle East and with Yemenis. And right now, he mentioned the link between Iran and Houthis. How much do we know about the link between these two? Is Iran, are they just obeying the order from Iran to do whatever Iran wants them to do, or it's something related to the Yemenis, to the way that they see the conflict in Gaza?
Absolutely not, in terms of your first suggestion that they're doing what Iran tells them to do. I made a pretty detailed study of this when I was advancing the legislation, helping to advance the legislation in the House of Representatives that actually passed both houses, the Senate and the House, to get us out of that war, supporting the Saudis and the Emirates at that time. That legislation passed because the Democrats essentially came across and said to the Republicans, this is really not good. It's a violation of the War Powers Act and therefore a violation of the Constitution. So we should pass this. Well, Pelosi, she fought it, and then it got there. Then when she realized that it was probably going to pass, and Trump would veto it, she went ahead and favored it and let it pass, and it passed both houses. And we had an act, a special act based on the War Powers Act that said essentially we'd stop supporting the Saudis and the Emirates and others in that war. And of course, it got vetoed. So, Pelosi knew it'd get vetoed. So that's the only reason she supported it. Devious Democrats in that sense. But I say all that to say, as we were studying that, as we were looking into that and finding out exactly what the United States was doing with regard to supporting the Saudis, with regard to prosecuting that war ourselves through the Saudis, as we looked at all that, we looked at Iran too. We wanted to see just how truthful the administration was being with regard to what Iran was giving the Houthis and support and such. What we found was the Houthis were giving Iran the extended middle finger about half the time. They were not following Iran's orders. They were doing what they've been doing ever since, as I indicated to you. They formed themselves in 92 and then changed leaders in 94 and got more powerful and more readily capable during that time frame, recruited more soldiers and such. The Houthis are operating for themselves. Now, they're not going to tell Iran, if Iran says we've got some missiles for you or we've got some bullets for you or whatever, they're not going to tell them no if they can get their hands on them. They're going to take those supplies. The same with Russia, the same with China or anyone else. Nima, I wouldn't be surprised if the United States weren't providing them with some weapons, because as I told you, we got to make $50 billion a year. We have to make $50 billion a year to satisfy the military industrial complex. So Iran backing the Houthis is a tale that goes all the way back to that beginning when Mohammed bin Salman started the war, thought he was going to get his feet wet in being Minister of Defense, and he really did get his feet wet in blood, mostly civilian blood. And I could find none, nor could any of my colleagues find any real contact between Iran and the Houthis. It was all the United States saying that so that we could justify what we were doing to support the Saudis and the Emirates in their bloody war against the Houthis. And I'm talking about a bloody war where the Saudis actually went in and cut off the port of Hodeidah and blockaded it so they couldn't get food in. They were trying to starve them. And what they were doing, of course, was starving innocent civilians in Yemen. I mean, this was horrible what we were doing, and we were supporting. The empire was behind that war with the Saudis and the Emiratis on the other side. And it was a vicious war. It's still a vicious war, but the Houthis have more or less taught the other side, hey, we're not going to fold. We're not going to give up. You're going to have to come kill every single one of us, and we're tough. And I'd say they're probably some of the most valiant, courageous fighters in Southwest Asia.
It seems that the Trump administration, Trump himself, is getting closer to MBS, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Is that going to influence the way that they're trying to be just in the middle, not doing anything, considering Yemenis, or they're going to get involved at the end of the day?
I think this is Trump's effort once again to resurrect what he thought was going to be this corridor of economic and financial power all the way from, the Red Sea up through Israel and into Turkey. I don't see any other purpose for it other than that. And I think it's fair to say that we're close to that idea being dead, and Israel has killed it. I don't think Mohammed bin Salman, I don't think the Emir in Qatar, I don't think any of the Arabs are going to want to deal with Israel for a long time to come. And that's saying something, because, the Arabs will deal with anybody if there's money in it. That's the raw truth of it. As Powell used to say to me, that's right after Bandar had left his office, he would talk about the Saudis and what they wanted and how they would get it. It's all money with them. It's all about money. But I think now it's about considering the feelings of their populace, about looking at the future in terms of that populace, and about the situation with the Palestinians, which has really probably been in the corridors of the royals, a hell of a discussion in terms of what Trump has been saying, what Trump has been doing to an extent, and most of all, what Netanyahu's been doing. I think it's fair to say, Nima, that Riyadh and other Arab capitals are probably thinking that they can't live with Israel. And so that's going to foreclose almost any of these fabulous transactions that Trump was envisioning that would include at their heart Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Israel, all the things that Netanyahu was aiming at too, with, for example, the Abraham Accords, which are dead in the water now. I mean, dead, completely dead. No one's going to resurrect them. And it's a question. It's still a question in my mind. Will Israel be a state? Will it be a state? If it is a state, it will be clearly an apartheid state, reviled by the world, reviled by the United Nations, maybe even dismissed as a member of the United Nations. There's heavy talk about that right now in New York. Will Israel continue to exist as a state entity? So there's no prospect in my mind for Trump's grand bargain, grand deal, whatever you want to call it, with Riyadh and other Arab countries bringing Israel into it. They will not tolerate it.
Let's remember what was the situation in Israel before Trump coming to power. We know that their economy was not doing great. Many people were getting out of Israel. And how is that going to change under the Trump administration? What Donald Trump is capable of doing for them, helping them?
That's a good question. I'm understanding right now. Yeah, when I said they violated the ceasefires, I didn't mean just with Gaza or with the Hamas in particular. They violated the ceasefire with Lebanon every single day. I've read Haaretz every day. There's somebody killed in Lebanon, somebody killed on the West Bank, somebody killed in Gaza, 400 some odd yesterday in Gaza, every day. So there's no ceasefire. What I found out about 3 days ago was that those who had returned in the north, most of them have now gone back again. They didn't think that they were safe, and so probably rightfully they left. What is Israel going to do when it wakes up one morning and people have wholesalely decided that the purpose of Israel, having been to give a safe haven to Jews, principally initially those from Europe, and there's no safe haven left. There is no such thing as a safe haven. They got lulled into the last few years. They got lulled into thinking that the discotheques were no longer bombed. The buses were no longer bombed. They had a great, just, incredible economy, which was based on the same thing our economy is based on, essentially air and feathers. But nonetheless, they created billionaires. They had great tech and all this. They were selling weapons to the world. That's the truth too. They were selling weapons to anybody who would put the cash on the barrelhead. And Ukraine was too. I know that because I was working with them at the time. They were essentially a little United States in the Levant. That's what Israel was. Well, they aren't anymore. They aren't, and they are hard pressed. Their economy is in many ways not on steroids anymore. It's on pain pills right now. The port of Eilat is shut down. Thank the Houthis very much. It is questionable whether or not the economy of Israel can be revived. It is questionable whether people are going to feel like they can stay in Israel and not just be safe, which I think is very dubious now, but also prosper. So how do you maintain a state if that's your condition? I don't know how you do it, and I don't think they're going to be able to do it unless something changes really swiftly and the whole fabric of Israel is turned inside out almost, and you have a different country, a different state. One of the things we do at the IPC, the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, every other Sunday, is we listen to people on both sides of the argument. As you might imagine, the argument now is sometimes devolving to people saying such things as, even though they buy into the simulation, and they buy into the fact we've held an election and we've had 5 million people vote within the 14.7 million between the river and the sea, both Jewish and Arab and Christian. And we have formed this government. They buy into the idea from a simulation aspect, but then they consult reality, the reality of this moment, and they bring that into the simulation. And it's really hard to deal with it because they will say such things as was said this last Sunday. How can you even think that you could have a constitution and you can have a government over the Israeli government and whatever is a Palestinian government without first having a Palestinian state? And you're not going to have a Palestinian state. So this is all farce. This is all farce. Well, to a certain extent, they're bringing up a very real point that haunts us, trying to figure out how we go and how we make this work and even possibly put it into operation. You've got to have another state. This is what the Arabs are saying. You've got to have another state. You've got to have something to deal with regard to the Palestinians. I don't think Hamas is the answer. I simply don't think Hamas is the answer. I don't think the Palestinian Authority is the answer. Mahmoud Abbas is a joke. He's a total joke. And his whole organization is a total joke. More complicit with the Israelis than with the Palestinian interests. So where do you go from there? And I'm continually going to this every other Sunday simulation and wondering the same thing in the back of my mind. Are we just, counting the deck chairs on the Titanic? How would we ever be able to implement this given the current situation and given the unbending nature of Bibi Netanyahu and those around him, especially Ben Gvir and Smotrich, whom he is risking to a certain extent, enormous political capital right now trying to rescue and keep in the coalition because they are the most dramatic demagogues, genocidal maniacs that he has in his government.
Authority on things that are happening in his part of the world and indeed farther afield. And I'm very glad to say on this very dramatic knife edge that we stand in the Persian Gulf, Professor Marandi has been able to join us. Professor, as always, an honor to talk with you. I spoke in my monologue about the savagery of the American attack on Yemen. But in truth, they've never stopped attacking Yemen for a very long time. And yet the Yemeni people remain in their millions, completely resolute. How do we account for that?
Well, it's a great honor being on your show, as always. I think it's obvious to everyone that Trump has made a major mistake. He doesn't have any special card up his sleeve that Biden did not have. He has the same weapons and the same destructive capabilities to murder women and children as Biden did. The arrogance of power, the arrogance of empire is what makes Americans constantly miscalculate, whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere, or in Ukraine, as we see today. It is the arrogance of power that causes them to go in thinking that they're going to win this one because they are special and they're above and beyond the rest of us. And ultimately they fail and their empire weakens every time. And hopefully today we are witnessing the final days of this empire. The Ansarullah movement, which is, they're not the Houthis, as they're often called. The Houthis is a tribe. Ansarullah is a national movement, which includes Houthis and it includes others. And it has many allies in Yemen, and now it's a household name across the region. It is the heroic force that has stood up to the United States and to the Israelis, and which is alongside Hezbollah, has sacrificed to try to stop the genocide against another people, not their own, which I think is the ultimate sacrifice. But these people have fought against Saudi Arabia, their genocidal war alongside the Emiratis, this genocidal war that they carried out for 7 years against Yemen with the support of the United States and the collective West. And they failed. And the Saudis spent hundreds of billions of dollars, not hundreds of millions, not billions, not tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And they're next door. So they were bombing day and night. They built up mercenary armies and they failed. And they never took the capital, Sana'a. Why? Because Ansarullah is popular, because it is legitimate. It is not a proxy. Iran supports it. Iran is honored to support it, but they are independent. And they say that the Israeli regime, as long as it's carrying out a starvation siege, they will not allow its ships to pass through the Red Sea. They are enforcing the Genocide Convention. And what do they get in return? Instead of being thanked, the Americans and the British bombed them, and the Qatar, the Emirates, the Saudis, and Bahrain all facilitate the attack in order to bring them to their knees. But it's going to fail. It failed in the past. It will fail today, and it will fail in the weeks ahead. And I think we already see some signs, and I may be wrong, of Trump backing down, because he just wrote another message where he said the Iranians have now decreased their support. His previous rant was only 2 days ago. How could Iran decrease its support in 48 hours? So I think it's possible that he's recognized that this bombing campaign is not going to do any damage to the Ansarullah and Yemeni armed forces underground facilities. It's just murdering ordinary people, making Trump look as evil and sinister as Biden, and it is making Ansarullah more popular than ever before in the eyes of the people on the streets across the region.
I'll come back to these principalities that you referred to earlier in a minute, but I suppose the big enchilada is this. Is Trump and the UK, Starmer, I don't know what they do, whether they blow up the tires of the aircraft before they take off or some other menial task, maybe work in the mess for the American pilots. But the US and UK, are they bombing Yemen as a proxy for bombing you, for bombing Iran? Is that Yemen's real crime? That so far, neither the British nor the Americans have the bottle to bomb Iran, so why not bomb its neighbor with whom it has close and friendly relations?
I think there are a couple of things here. One is I think that the United States knows that in Ukraine it's going to lose, and that Russia has the upper hand, and that however this war ends in Ukraine, the West and the United States and NATO, they're all going to look weak. And Trump is going to be blamed. So Trump would like to look strong in Yemen. And also, in order to battle, let's say, the deep state and his opponents, whether in Europe or in the United States, who are going to, I think, increase the pressure, especially as the economy will continue to get worse, most probably, he does want the Zionist lobby on his side. That's how I see it. But I think in addition to that, the point you make is probably the most important point, and that is that bombing Yemen is the next best thing to bombing Iran. They can't bomb Iran because Iran can destroy the global economy. So they bomb Yemen instead. They murder Yemeni women and children in the hope that they can intimidate Iran, but also in the hope that the Zionist lobby, that they will be satisfied with Trump standing shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu in the slaughter of the people of Gaza and in the slaughter of women and children in Yemen. I think the military, the US military, knows quite well that a war with Iran would mean the end of the global economy as we know it. The oil and gas assets and its installations in the Persian Gulf region, along with the petrochemical plants and the refineries, and all the other the desalination plants, all of these are vulnerable. The Persian Gulf is not very wide, and Iran owns one side of it. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. If there is war, these tiny Arab family dictatorships on the other side that host US bases, they won't last. Many of them, like Qatar, only have like 350,000 passport holders. Most people there are foreigners. They're indentured servants at best, if not slaves. The same is true in the Emirates. So if there is war, these regimes will all collapse very swiftly, and the global economy will collapse. And that will be the end of the US empire. It will be the end of Trump's presidency. And imagine if the global economy collapses, which will be catastrophic for all of us. Imagine how many people will be on the move. The Americans complain about immigrants from Latin America, which largely go to the United States because of the damage that the United States did to Latin America over the decades. Imagine if the economy collapses across the world, people in Latin America will be streaming to North America in much greater numbers than we see today. And the same is true in Europe. People from Africa and West Asia will be moving towards Europe like a flood, in far greater numbers than today, even though the economies of North America and Europe will also collapse. But people will be moving to where they think there may be hope. So it's mind-boggling, I think, what would happen if there's a war. And I think there are enough sane people in the Pentagon, sinister but sane, who would tell the president that this is simply a bridge too far. However, it's not impossible for there to be a war because you have the Zionist lobby and you have Netanyahu, whose personal interest is in war. Netanyahu has really destroyed the Israeli regime. He's exposed it to the world through his brutality and the brutality of the regime. The biggest loser in these 18 months is the Israeli regime because it's been shown to the world as morally illegitimate. But Netanyahu himself is a winner because he's been able to survive and stay in power because of these wars. So he is interested in expanding the war. But so far, I think probably the people in the Pentagon would have the upper hand and be telling Trump that war with Iran would be utterly disastrous.
Well, I was going to return to the principalities, but I think you've dealt quite comprehensively with them. So let me turn to Gaza. The ground invasion, albeit a pinpoint ground invasion, rather like the limited invasion of Rafah that you'll recall from last year, has begun. What's that all about in your point of view?
I think the very fact that we've had 18 months of genocide, with the exception of a brief break, where even during these 2 months where we had a so-called ceasefire, on average, 3 Palestinians a day were being murdered in the Gaza Strip, and the ethnic cleansing and murder in the West Bank increased dramatically. And we also had a murder a day in Lebanon. So this was never really a ceasefire. But except for these couple of months that it's been more quiet, the Israeli regime has been carrying out genocide basically because Netanyahu needs war. And so he cannot stop the war. He is going to have to constantly expand the war, enter Gaza, bomb Gaza, in order to satisfy his partners in government, his fanatical religious Zionists, in order to stay in power. And he has had success. You see the head of Shin Bet is now out. He's gotten his way. He's becoming more like the emperor of Israel. And the more secular, liberal Zionists who are just as genocidal towards the Palestinians, they are very unhappy. And the divide in Israel and among the people who live in that regime, the divide is extraordinarily great. And some believe it can become deadly. So he needs to keep pushing. But I do not see the regime succeeding in Gaza, just as I do not see the United States succeeding in Yemen. They will only continue to slaughter more people, and they will become more despised. And George, I really think that in a way, restarting a Holocaust is even worse than continuing a Holocaust. For well over a year, people like yourself and others have been active to create awareness. But after a period of time, after months of seeing dead children and beheaded babies, it becomes normalized. But when the so-called ceasefire took effect, the international community took a collective sigh of relief. Even though, as I said, they were still killing people. But now when Netanyahu restarts this genocide, people are stunned and shocked. And especially in one day, he slaughtered over 400 people, almost 200 of them children. This angers people. It intensifies the animosity towards the Israeli regime. This, I think, is a huge mistake. It is evil, utterly evil, but it is also extremely damaging for the regime. I continue to believe that the Israeli regime is in its final stage of existence. I'm not saying it's going to end tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, but it has been exposed to the world for what it is, and those powers that lie behind it have been discredited, and they continue to decline in power. These are dark days, but I believe that in the future we will see light at the end of the tunnel.
Finally, you are, of course, the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Let me take advantage of that. You are a man of many parts. did you have time to look at the JFK files that were released today, if indeed they were released? I've described it as looking for a needle in a haystack from which the needle has been removed. I'm wondering if you have any of the same feelings.
Yes, it is like looking for a needle in the haystack, and indeed the needle has been removed. But I think those who've been looking and those who understand a thing or two, they know exactly what it was that has been removed. And I think the very fact that it has been removed says more than enough. It says enough about what happened in the past, and it shows enough about us and a great deal about what the United States is today. The same is true with the Epstein files. At the end of the day, a lot of it will be redacted, but people will know enough. Those who want to know, those who want to open their eyes, they will see the truth. Just like in Syria, those who want to open their eyes to the reality of ISIS and Al Qaeda and that this was an American operation will understand it. Those who want to close their eyes and continue with their sectarian hatred, they will keep their eyes closed. Those Americans or Europeans who want to believe that the West, that the Western political establishment is the free world and that they're the most civilized of all of us, they can continue to close their eyes. But the rest of us in the West and the rest of those in Europe and the United States, they know that that needle is missing from the haystack, and they know with the Epstein files, they will not find that needle when those files are released either.
San Jose, Toledo, Ohio, and Toronto, Ontario. Go to jimmygore.com for a link for tickets. So Trump is bombing the heck out of Yemen right now. And why is this especially noteworthy? Because Trump ran on being a non-interventionist and get the hell out of the Middle East. But he's once again doing the bidding of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. That's why he's bombing the hell out of Yemen. By the way, Joe Biden bombed the hell out of Yemen his entire presidency. Barack Obama did the same thing. Trump did it previously. But here he was in May of 2024 saying that they shouldn't. Watch this.
I look at your policies, I see secure the borders, bring jobs back. I look at the Democrats and many Republicans, and it's foreign war and foreign expansion.
That's right.
What is that?
I think it's just a failed mentality. It's crazy. You can solve problems over a telephone. Instead, they start dropping bombs. I see recently they're dropping bombs all over Yemen. You don't have to do that. You can talk in such a way where they respect you and they listen to you. Viktor Orban of Hungary, you know, the leader, they call him a strong man. Who cares if he's a strong man or not a strong man? He's a very powerful guy. He said the problem the world has is that Donald Trump is no longer president. When he was president, China didn't play around, Russia didn't play around, nobody played around, and we had no problems. Today, the whole world is on fire.
I heard that from America.
So he said you could solve this Yemen thing with a phone call. Also, I guess you could start bombing them again with the phone call. You know, Joe Biden bombed them like 100 times in 2024 alone. And there he was saying, you don't have to do this. You don't have to bomb Yemen. He says specifically Yemen. And now he's specifically bombing the hell out of them again. Trump warns Yemen's Houthis will be completely annihilated. What? What happened to the phone call? I don't know. I don't know what happened to the phone call. He's flipping on his word like a trained dolphin. That's what's happening. So what does MAGA stand for today? My ass got ambushed? Is that what it stands for? Because there it is. U.S. President renews his call for Iran to end support for Yemeni groups that have been targeting Israel over its war in Gaza. What in the F? Again, this is not America first. This is Israel first. Let's go. Marjorie Taylor Greene. Couldn't be more MAGA. Guess what she says? She says, I have not heard a single American say they want another war in the Middle East or anywhere else. Not one.
Glad she said this.
All I've heard is a loud cry demanding our government and its leaders put America first. I don't support going to war on behalf of other countries because that's what Trump just said. He's doing this for Israel. Well, if Israel would stop slaughtering the Palestinians, they wouldn't have a problem with the Houthis in Yemen. I support peace and fixing our own massive problems for our own people. It's literally my job title, U.S. Representative. Sam Husseini, the guy who got kicked out of the last briefing by Antony Blinken at the press room at the State Department, he says, if you believe this, you should file articles of impeachment. So why does Marjorie Taylor Greene, why can she speak out like this? Because she doesn't take any money from AIPAC or Israel. Zero money received from AIPAC. And I just want you to, here's the Dave Smith, Jew, libertarian, and anti-war. And just remember what he had to say about this.
I like what that guy said. Benjamin Netanyahu came and testified before Congress in 2002, and he said with certainty that if we overthrew Saddam Hussein, democracy would sweep the region. He also advocated that we had regime change in Libya, Syria, and Iran. And he's still advocating that to this day. You must recognize that anyone advocating that America go fight another stupid, catastrophic war in the Middle East is your enemy. They are our enemies. Anyone who advocates that. If they start talking to you about fighting a war with Iran, you treat them like an enemy that they are. They are not on your side. Our people do not want to fight any more wars in the Middle East, period.
So he's saying Israel's our enemy, and now Donald Trump is ramping up wars in Yemen. He's literally doing it without, by the way, it's illegal. They don't, the Congress is the only people who are supposed to be able to declare war. He didn't ask Congress. He's just doing it. Biden bombed Yemen 1,000 times. And so Trump is just another continuation. He's just keeping it going. And he's doing this saber rattling with Iran. This is all pointing towards, because Israel wants a war with Iran. And as Dave Smith says, anybody who wants a war with another war is your enemy. And here's what Scott Ritter has to say. Scott Ritter has to say about Donald Trump and his stupid adventure in Yemen. Listen to this.
Well, I mean, first of all, the American people need to know that the Houthi of Yemen have been in war with the America via proxy since 2014. The Saudi Arabian Air Force using aircraft provided by the United States of America, dropping bombs provided by the United States of America, bombs targeted by the intelligence provided by the United States of America.
The same thing Israel's doing in Gaza, Saudi Arabia was doing in Yemen. So we give them the money, we give them the bombs, we give them all the things. They go slaughter the people in Gaza. Same thing. That's what Saudi Arabia has been doing since 2014 in Yemen. And again, this is all about natural resources, natural gas and oil. That's what this is all about. And so and then the United States was assisting, not only that, providing the airplanes and the bomb, but also assisting in intelligence and targeting Saudi Arabia to wipe out the Yemenis people. Here we go.
Been pummeling Yemen for a decade, and Yemen hasn't blinked. The United States got involved in, participating in these attacks last year, or even for over a year now. We've been in a quasi war with the Houthi because the Houthi are very principled people, and they said we will not stand by idly while genocide is taking place. The Palestinian people of Gaza must be allowed access to humanitarian goods. The blockade must be lifted, and until which time those conditions are met, we will prevent Israeli shipping from transiting through the Red Sea into the Port of Eilat. And they succeeded in shutting down the shipping. The port went bankrupt. The Israeli economy was devastated. Now, this is a Houthi action against the Israelis, and America stuck its nose in it. And then America said, no, you can't do this. You have to cease your blockade. And the Houthi said, stick it in your ear. And we started bombing them. Terrible bombs, according to Trump. I mean, my God, what? Because Donald Trump ordered a bomb that blows up with greater explosive force than the bomb that was dropped under Biden. Trump is an idiot. I hate to say that, and my wife is going to be very mad at me for saying this, but this is the kind of stupidity that a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said, Mr. President, stop, cease and desist. The Secretary of Defense has to do an intervention and say, please don't do this. You are making us look stupid. You're putting us in a bad situation, and it's unbecoming of the Commander-in-Chief to speak in this fashion about conflict when American lives are on the line. Treat the Americans with respect, at least. Use words that impart the dignity of the service they are giving you instead of treating it like a childish video game. Mr. President, shut up. And that's what he needs to do. Shut up. If you're going to drop bombs, drop bombs. But quit pretending that because you're Donald Trump, the earth shakes greater because you dropped the damn bomb than somebody else. The bomb blows up. And you know who doesn't care? The Houthi. They don't give a damn, Mr. President. They're going to kick your ass just like they kicked everybody's ass because you can't follow through. All you can do is drop bombs. And your bombs won't stop them from firing missiles. And then you want to now threaten the Iranian people the same way. It isn't going to work, Mr. President. And what's going to happen are one of two things. One, you're going to look foolish because you're going to have to back down when your Secretary of Defense says we can't escalate any further without putting 700,000 boots on the ground. That's a major invasion that will cause the entire region to blow up. Oil prices will spin out of control and your economy will crash and you're finished, Mr. President. You're done. Everything you're trying to do, the American people will not tolerate $120 oil because they can't economically. All the changes you're making are predicated upon a foundation of economic stability. Mr. President, you can't bomb these people into submission. There's a video of a Houthi fighter going out to recover the body of his friend. The man's wearing sandals. He's got his little dish dash on, not body armor. He's not dressed like an American commando and all this kind of stuff. And he's running with his body through enemy fire. You see the bullets kicking all around him. They're trying to and he keeps running in the desert under fire with a body on his shoulders, and he recovers his friend. That's who we're fighting. We can make fun of them. We can use all the derogatory terms we want. They wear sandals. They do this. They do that. They do this. They're the toughest people in the world when it comes to fighting in that area of the world, and we are not going to beat them.
So remember what Donald Trump said not in 2015. Sheldon Adelson is looking to give big dollars to Marco Rubio because he feels he can mold him into his perfect little puppet. Well, that's exactly what happened to Donald Trump. Sheldon Adelson's wife gave him $100 million and molded him into this little puppet. And now he's doing the bidding of the Adelsons, Benjamin Netanyahu, AIPAC, and the Zionists. That's what this is. That's what this all, the war about with Iran, the war with Yemen, Gaza. This is all about him being a puppet. And he's doing it. And we all thought he was going to come in and lay down the law, and he's not. He's not. And Marjorie Taylor Greene sees it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I have not heard a single American say they want another war in the Middle East or anywhere else. Not one. And let me tell you another thing. Iran just signed a treaty with Russia. So if the United States attacks Iran, it's going to be as if they attacked Russia. So this is, again, where we said World War III is going to start in the Middle East if Trump keeps going along with his Israel first policy. And that's what he's going to get himself stuck in. He's going to get us in World War III, and your kids are going to go fight it. I'm not going to go fight it. That's what's happening. And that's Mr. Anti-War, Mr. Hey, we can do this with a phone call. You don't have to drop bombs. So when Joe Biden was dropping 1,000 bombs on Yemen, he was critical of it, and now he's immediately doing the bidding of Benjamin Netanyahu and Adelson. Immediately. She knows. Marjorie Taylor Greene knows. And why does she know? Because she doesn't take any of their money. Dave Smith knows. I know. And now you know. And so Trump's promises of being an anti-interventionist, ending the war, getting us out of the Middle East, ending the stupid wars and investing that money back here, it's a lie.
What happened to promises made, promises kept?
What happened to promises made? What happened to ending wars with a phone call? So this is leading us into World War III. Because this is all about Benjamin Netanyahu. He wanted us to go into Yemen. We did it. He wanted us to go into Syria. We did it. Iraq. We did it. Libya. We did it. Afghanistan. We did it. And the last one on the list, Lebanon, we did. Last one on the list is now Iran. And that's what this is all about. And that's because Benjamin Netanyahu and the psychopathic Zionists won't stop slaughtering the Gazans because they want to eradicate them and ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank so they can take it over. That's what this has always been about. Then they become energy exporters because remember they found $500 billion worth of energy under Gaza and off the shore, natural gas. Remember that? They want to be sending the natural gas. That's another reason why they wanted the Ukraine war and they wanted to blow up the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline, is because they wanted to be the ones exporting energy to Europe, Israel, instead of Russia. That's another reason why they wanted the Ukraine war and wanted to do that. This is all about the psychopathic Zionist and Benjamin Netanyahu, and we're their puppets. Doesn't that make you upset that we're the puppet of a tiny little country and a bunch of psychopaths? That doesn't make you upset? Hey, why don't they go take care of themselves? Why don't they stop bombing everybody and getting the United States to do all their dirty work? Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Syria. That's all this is about. This is all about Israel first. Nobody in America wants another war in the Middle East, except Israel. They do want one. They want us to bomb Iran. And they want us to install another Shah. That's what we did. When they had a democratically elected president, Mossadegh, in 1953, the CIA overthrew him and installed the Shah, which was an oppressive dictator, because America loves dictators, even though they pretend they don't. We don't fight dictators. We're in bed with dictators. We're in bed with Saudi Arabia. We're in bed with Shah of Iran. And then there was what the CIA calls blowback, and they got rid of the Shah of Iran, and they installed this ultra religious Shah, what is it called? A theocracy. And that's what they live under now. And that's blowback to us getting rid of their democracy, installing a strongman, an oppressive dictator, the Shah. And now Benjamin Netanyahu wants us to do it again. And Trump's going to do it. Hey, you know, the IRS is the largest tax collection.
The JFK files have been released, and I'm not going to lie. There's some suspect information in there that I think we should be paying attention to. Some people are claiming that most of this information was already known and this is a big nothing burger, but I beg to differ. For example, the average American had no idea that the CIA was requesting that all mentions of Israel be redacted from the JFK files. Now, if Israel was not involved in JFK's assassination in any way, form, or fashion, I'm not sure why it would be necessary to remove Israel's name from literally all of the files. We also know that for some reason, there was only one man who acted as liaison between the U.S. intelligence community and Israel. That man is James Angleton. And if you look at that date, he was part of the CIA from 1954 to 1975. This means two things. He was there before JFK got elected, and he was also there after JFK was assassinated. The second thing is that Israel, despite only being created in 1948, had so much power and influence that they had a personal liaison within the U.S. government and were responsible for running covert operations on behalf of the U.S. government. It also was Allen Dulles, not Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president, who put Angleton in charge of this very specific correspondence between Israel and Angleton. And Angleton had so much power and control over this information that he was able to even pick and choose just how much information got to the FBI regarding Israel's involvement in U.S. intelligence operations. In other words, whether it be the Bay of Pigs, other covert operations in Latin America, or even false flags within the country, if Israel was involved, it would only be up to Angleton between 1954 and 1975 to decide whether or not the people knew about their involvement, which might explain why the CIA was so adamant about requesting Israel's name be redacted from the JFK files. So whether it be the assassination of JFK, the assassination of RFK, the assassination of MLK, Malcolm X, I mean, the list goes on, not only domestically, but internationally. If Israel was involved, only Angleton would know. And only Angleton could choose whether or not we knew. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are the JFK files. So if Cuba and Fidel Castro was brought up a lot, wouldn't be a surprise. If Russia was brought up a lot, wouldn't be a surprise. Chile, even the CIA itself, Lee Harvey Oswald, there's a lot of names that could have been brought up and no one would bat an eye. But in 1954, 6 years after the creation of Israel, for some reason, They're mentioned in the JFK papers damn near more than JFK himself. And roughly 12 years later, they could have been involved in the assassination of the very president who directly called out the CIA, who Angleton was working for, and said that them and their shadow government would not run the world. How could they accrue so much power in so little time? Unless maybe Zionists were already running the show long before Israel officially became a state. And that's probably despite all of the debate and all of the people who didn't want Israel to become a state. That's how they were able to become a state anyway. And no, unfortunately, we cannot say if Israel was directly involved in JFK's assassination. What we can say for certain is that at least, I don't know, everybody has suspected the U.S. government and the intelligence community was involved, and they were aware of Angleton's involvement with Israel and that he controlled the dissemination and flow of information about the operations Israel was involved in. And that entire time, no one put their foot on his neck to figure out if Israel was involved. And we have enough information and knowledge about how Israel operates at this point to know that it's at least a possibility that these people are psychopaths who killed one of our most popular presidents because he challenged the intelligence community. And yet, we are funding the genocide that just killed 400 civilians yesterday. We know that Israel is directly responsible for Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And yet we still continue to fund their genocide and call them an ally. I mean, we even know that pedophiles and sexual predators literally run to Israel to get immunity. They have more pedophiles per capita than any other country in the world. And yet we still call them an ally and fund their genocide. So the biggest takeaway from the JFK files is that we're only starting to scratch the surface of just how corrupt Israel is, and that if they've acted against the interests of the United States, we're not even allowed to know about it. Which begs the question, was Israel working for Angleton or was Angleton working for Israel?
I think there are two main problems with holding US dollar assets. We have all seen how the US went in together with Europe. They took over Russia's assets, and they're using some of the profits to fund Ukraine right now. I mean, it's their prerogative, but there are consequences to such actions, right? A lot of countries out there, especially in the BRICS, China, obviously Russia, it's going to be a cold winter and hell if they're going to go back to US treasuries anytime soon. There's not much incentive. And if you look at China's perspective, why am I lending money to the US government to fund their activities, which is ultimately going to boomerang and contain my own economy? It just doesn't make sense at this point.
Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome into the studio Sean Fu. Now, many of you who follow my channel probably follow his. He's one of the fastest growing channels that really focuses on finances, international trade. I mean, we're talking BRICS, the rise of gold, crypto. I mean, everything. You're covering it all, Sean. Welcome to the show tonight.
Hey, thanks to be here. Thanks for inviting me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sean, I know you're in Singapore, and I want to get your insights, from that part of the world because, as someone that studies, economics and is an active trader, someone that's investing all the time, well, I want to know your opinion on the trade war and how Trump's tariff policy is going.
Well, I think the trade war has always been brewing for the last 3 to 4 years. It was just that Joe Biden didn't really have the gumption to go ahead with it. There was a lot of, problems with Ukraine and Israel back then. But right now, we're seeing Trump try to shift the US more towards a protectionist policy. However, he's doing too many things at once, right? We can see him, together with Elon Musk, is cutting down a lot of federal workers to Doge.
Yeah.
And now he's pursuing another trade policy on the world with his global tariff war. And to most economists out there, investors, traders, we all know what a tariff means, right? Most of the time, it's not the exporters who pay it. Most of the time, it's the importers paying it, and it gets filtered down to the consumers. There are some arguments that, yes, the exporters might eat a bit, but the majority of the hit will be on Americans. And this is something that we need to consider, Cyrus. I think you have heard of the meme, not really the meme, a fact that 80% of stuff in Walmart is made in China to some degree, more or less. And it's going to be impossible for the US supply chain to suddenly conjure up factories out of thin air tomorrow to replace the demand and the supply coming from China. So in the end, the US consumer will have to eat the tariffs. So this is not good for inflation, and it's not good for the US consumers, obviously.
Yeah, I know that's a great answer. You know, what's interesting, Sean, is I speaking to a lot of Americans here. It's amazing how many people don't understand what a tariff actually is. I mean, essentially, a tariff is a tax. And I was given an analogy to a group of friends here, and they had said, you know, this is great. Trump is making America great again. You know, we're really going to stick it to China and, you know, go through with these tariffs. And I said, well, you know, China doesn't pay the tariff, right? If a pair of Nike shoes costs $100 and we have a 20% tariff, you know, that will now be $120. You know, you're paying that extra $20. So it is an interesting, I think it works on paper, right? You know, it's like, ideally, we would like to encourage you not to buy the Chinese built Nikes and you buy shoes that are made in America, but there's very few shoes that are made in America. So, you know, what is Nike going to do? Are they going to relocate their factories here after building, you know, their massive supply chain all over Asia? You know, the answer to that obviously is no. So it's an interesting one about this. I want to switch to the US dollar. And this is an interesting thing. I think you made a recent video talking about how a lot of countries are dumping US dollar. They're you know, not wanting to hold. They're actually selling this US debt. What's going on right now in the markets, and especially these countries as they're, you know, dumping dollars and not wanting to hold that debt anymore?
Sure. I think there are two main problems with holding US dollar assets, right? Especially when it comes to debt. Now, the first most pressing one is definitely the sanctions. We have all seen how the US went in together with Europe. They took over Russia's assets, and, you know, they're using some of the profits to fund Ukraine right now. I mean, it's their prerogative, but there are consequences to such actions, right? A lot of countries out there, especially in the BRICS, China, obviously Russia, it's going to be a cold winter in hell if they're going to go back to US treasuries anytime soon. There's not much incentive. And if you look at China's perspective, why am I lending money to the US government to fund their activities, which is ultimately going to boomerang and contain my own economy? It just doesn't make sense at this point. So that is the factor of the sanctions that we really need to appreciate. And we have seen a lot of threats from Trump. Thankfully, he has not done it yet. A 100% tariff on BRICS, trying to de-dollarize, right? You know, there's a point between acting crazy all the time and, you know, posturing, but this kind of things, it feeds into the mindset of leaders all around the world. And that is just on the tariff side. Now, consider the fiscal situation of the United States. It's not really that great to hold US Treasury bonds as well. I think a recent survey just came out of US consumers expecting inflation for the next 5 to 10 years to stay at 3.5%. Now, that's a far cry from what Powell is promising us, right? He's going to bring us back to the land of milk and honey of 2%, right? But it's not going. People on the ground, and I'm sure you can understand that when you go around, you know, the Walmart, prices are slowly elevating up despite what's going on. And because of this, we are going to reach a world where interest rates could keep going higher and higher and higher. So Cyrus, why would you buy a 10-year treasury bond today yielding 4% when there's a very good chance in the next 12 months or 2 years, your yield will be 6%. So you hold off. You don't want to buy it. And that actually raises the debt burden even higher. So it all comes down to the point that Trump, he's trying to maneuver the US economy, bring production back, which I understand, you know, if I were American, I also want some parts of it to be back. But it's just playing with too many moving parts at the same time.
Very good insight there, Sean. And you know, it's interesting. I have a list here of how China's government has actually reacted, because obviously there's always kind of a tit for tat movement, I believe, between the U.S. and China. Ironically, it's always the U.S. that usually starts and China retaliates. But you know, because of this additional tariffs, you know, we're looking at, for example, this is China's government putting tariffs on the United States in response to America, but it's basically additional tariffs of 15% on imported coal and liquefied natural gas originating from the U.S. We're seeing an additional 15 on crude oil, agricultural machinery, automobiles, pickup trucks, export controls related to tungsten, beryllium, bismuth, and indium. So we're going to get into these rare earth minerals. And that's where I want to shift our next focus on, is the rare earths. And I think this is a very interesting one, because China, you know, for those of you that don't know, they produce the vast majority of the rare earth minerals. And it's not so much the mining of that, it's actually the processing. So, you know, even if For example, there's a lot of talk with Ukraine right now, right? Ukraine actually has a lot of these minerals as well. Donald Trump, of course, is trying to do a deal with Zelensky, saying, hey, 50% of the profits that you're going to get from the future mining, you need to give back to the United States. We want those rights. But even if you get that, even if you had the raw material, how are you going to process that? And honestly, it's China, the one that leads the world in this process and controlling about 70% of that market.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about this. This is an interesting thing, with China and their dominance in the rare earth.
Now, moving back to the trade war, this is where we can actually get a deeper insight into it as well. So how the US fights the trade war is mainly with financial sanctions and tariffs, but China takes control of the supply chain, right? They can use the amount of resources they have, the decades and the trillions of dollars they spend to build up all these supply chains to really put the squeeze on the US. I think we can all go back 2 decades, 10, 20 years ago. China, they rolled out the BRI, right, the Belt Road Initiative, and a big part of it was to go to other places in the world, Africa, Latin America, these countries that were generally quite abandoned by the collective West, so as to speak, right? They don't want to send their money in there. So even while China was developing their economies, they decided to have a foothold in these economies, right? You can call it altruistic, you can call it pragmatic, but the fact is, they are there, they're building roads, they're building power plants, they are building mines, and they're harvesting a lot of minerals for both the domestic economy and for China's own supply chain as well. So now China has gone up the value chain, at least in these minerals. They're processing it as well. So all the expertise is there, as you correctly pointed out. Even if Trump gets his vaunted deal with Ukraine for $500 billion, 50%, where are you going to process it, right? It still has to go to China. Now, are there some other production plants elsewhere in the world? In the US, I don't doubt it. I'm sure there are a few. In Europe, definitely. But what is the cost of production? What is the cost of refining over there? If I can get something done in China for, say, arbitrary number, $10 a kilogram, right? But then if I were to do it in America for $30 a kilogram, $30 a pound, it's going to jack up my costs even higher. And this is what I really fear a bit for the US economy going forward, especially when it comes to all this protectionist measure. I believe that, you can reshore industries back to the US. However, a lot of the people there, they'll be paying for the extra inflation. And if your cost basis goes up too high, how are you going to compete with other countries, especially China, where you want to export your stuff out? So this is something that is a little concerning, to be frank.
Yeah. No, I love those insights. That's really good. And, I think you've hit on a really good topic here, is the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this is an interesting thing. You and I have both made a lot of videos on BRI and certainly BRICS as well. We'll continue to talk about those. But, specifically BRI, I think is interesting because it's been around for over a decade. We've seen over 150 countries around the world sign up to this. We've even seen European country like Italy who signed up. They actually withdrew from it and then they went back to it, which was quite an interesting development last year. And I really want to get your sense. You're based in Singapore. You're obviously they're in Asia, and there's a lot of development. For example, Malaysia, very big beneficiary of that. But I think Singapore has some amazing, relationship with China. A lot of trading, a lot of deals with China. What is tell us a little bit more about BRI specifically, and in your opinion, as a Singaporean, when you're looking at China making all of these moves through Southeast Asia and expanding, do you feel that that's a force for good? Are people benefiting from BRI?
Yeah, I think that's a force for good, right? Anytime when you go in and you try to develop a country, especially when they are, third world, second world, and you try to push them up, I think that's a net positive for any country out there. Well, China wants something out of it, of course, right? No country goes around and just gives money willy-nilly, asking nothing for return. So especially in Singapore, we have a lot of positive benefits from China. Just look at our tourism. I think there was a big jump in tourism in Singapore. And I kid you not, when I go to all the luxury stores everywhere, I see 80% Chinese.
Right.
And it's really scary. They go around with 2 bags of LV products, Dior, you name it, Hermes. And ultimately, that actually helps our local economy grow. It helps government grow their revenue. It helps build more opportunities for the locals, to service them in certain industries. So I think overall that's good. But more than just Singapore, you can see China going to other places like Malaysia, like Indonesia, going there to help them build up their industries, especially when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to semiconductors. Some of these countries, they're lagging behind a bit because of their lack of expertise.
Right.
And in a shocking twist of fate, right, we can see China's technical expertise has actually surpassed the US in certain aspects as well.
For sure.
So this is a very good kind of knowledge sharing exercise beyond just helping build infrastructure. So I think the BRI is more or less a net positive for good in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. I want to shift. I want to go back to the point that you brought up with earlier with BRICS, because I think this is an interesting one. It's worth revisiting here. We're looking at BRICS. Donald Trump has, I know he said 100% tariffs. I thought he actually increased that to potentially, 150% for the BRICS. And it's all about that US dollar, right? He wants to ensure that the US dollar remains the global reserve currency. But what is your opinion, with the way the BRICS organization is, continuing to develop? And this is something that you and I have both covered on both of our channels. And I like to talk about it with another YouTuber, someone that's studying it very clearly, because, just for everybody to recap, what we've seen is, every year, the presidency of BRICS rotates. So in 2024, Russia was the president. They host an annual meeting every October where all of the presidents of the BRICS countries come together. They all met in Russia last year. They had a big meeting, and there was a very big addition where they're now introducing partner countries. So not official members, but partner countries. There were 9 countries that came in. Many of them very significant, very fastly developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia. I believe Thailand and Malaysia were a part of that. So again, right there in Southeast Asia. Are we missing something about BRICS? For example, what if I don't think they're trying to create another currency. That was certainly a thought for a while, that they were going to have this new gold-backed currency. I think they have shifted away from that. Is BRICS really going to emerge really as just a trading organization? Are we going to be seeing more currency swap agreements, more deals being bartered just between countries? Tell us your thoughts on BRICS in general.
Sure. I think it's a little bit of both. BRICS started out mainly as a trading bloc, just basically connecting emerging economies together so that they can trade vice versa outside with the West and with the West. But we saw everything supercharged since 2018 when Trump came out with his first round of tariffs, and things just went ballistic from 2022 when Biden decided to, put the US in a situation where it was, or maybe still is today. And because of this, a lot of the BRICS countries, they now have to come together to fulfill both their production and consumption needs. And interestingly enough, right, if you look at just the oil production, oil demand in BRICS, the producers, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the UAE, they have enough production to satisfy the entire bloc's demand. So in a sense, they are self-circulating, they are self-contained economy as well.
Right.
Now, when we talk about the dollar and why Trump is so desperate to protect it, is that not just on the fringes, on the main trading hub between China and the BRICS, which is honestly where the flows of trade are, right? A lot of trade comes into China, and China trades with the rest of the BRICS. We can see now that cross-border trade has effectively crossed 50% in the Chinese currency, the RMB.
Right.
And this wasn't this year. It wasn't even last year. It was 2020, if I'm not wrong.
You're right. That's right.
So now we can comfortably expect it to be 55, 60%.
Right.
And this really poses a lot of trouble for Trump, for Scott Bessent, people in the Treasury who wants the circulation of dollars to continue. Because just think about this. If China continues to export more cars to the world, more stuff to the world, and let's say, hypothetically speaking, their semiconductor industry booms next year, and they have this massive lump of chips to share with the world, to export to the world, chances are they're going to invoice in Chinese currency, the yuan, the RMB, instead of the dollar.
Right.
And this is, I think, a clear point that really, threatens and puts quite a bit of fear in the Trump presidency as well. And that's why we are seeing him hammer down relentlessly with all his tariffs.
I've got let's continue this thought, because there's one theory out there with a lot of economists and some people that are studying this, that, for example, China's is overproducing right now. They're actually flooding the market with too many products. That we have invented this term called overcapacity, which is a very interesting one. I'm going to bring up a screenshot here that it's actually an opinion piece on the New York Times. It's entitled, "She is Making the World Pay for China's Mistakes." Quite a bold statement. And it's basically what it concludes to is that China's making too many products, and it's not good for the world because they're dominating manufacturing. And I think this is funny, because I think a better way to say that would be, she is helping the world pay for pay less for essential goods. That's essentially what it is. So, talk to me a little bit about the, overcapacity and, what we hear constantly about this, because you just alluded to that, right? What happens if China continues to make more electric vehicles? And by the way, yes, we can't buy Chinese EVs here in North America, right? They're banned in the United States and Canada. But what's very interesting is when you start going around the world, right? You start going to South America, even Europe now, and certainly Southeast Asia. I mean, Chinese automobiles are everywhere. Tell us a little bit more about the myth of overcapacity.
All right, sure. So when it comes to overcapacity, well, there is a glimmer of proof that China is trying to export their way out of a prolonged slump right now. There is some truth to that, right? You sell stuff to the world, you gain dollars, you gain revenue, and it helps your country grow, especially when you want to build up consumption.
Right.
But look at things in the greater picture. China is actually exporting deflation to the world. Because if you look at the Chinese ecosystem, it's truly brutal. I'm sure you've been there. I'm sure you've seen the amount of insane competition, not just between the EV makers, right? Just between cafes in China, just between handphone shops in China, the amount of micro innovation, the amount of insanity business goes on there is really remarkable. So Chinese companies, in a sense, they're devouring themselves. And as the world, sure, maybe you don't want to go into China and play the Hunger Games with them, but you'll get to enjoy the fruits of their labor, of their hardship. Prices keeps going down, and you can actually use some of this technology to boost your own economy up. So let's just use Europe, for example, right? We know that they have an energy crisis. I mean, by now everyone knows. Germany's power prices has gone up over the last 6 months, almost double, 50% to double. That's insane. And we know Europe themselves, they have self-imposed themselves into a very diplomatic and economic box. They are so-called not allowed to buy cheap Russian gas. In this case, who can help them? China. Get cheap solar panels in, build up your own renewable resources, stop all these tariffs on especially this kind of renewable power, and use what China is good for. Use them to benefit your own economy, and then everyone can live harmoniously. So when it comes to this idea of overcapacity, it's how you really want to play your cards.
No, that's a very, very good insight. And I love how you said that China is exporting deflation to the world because of the way that this Uber competition in China. And I think that's one insight I want to share with our viewers here is you hit on this very clearly. And I love that, don't just think about the EVs, it's anything, even from cafes to restaurants to the cell phone shops. I mean, there's intense competition in China, and really only the cream rises to the top, as we say, only the best of the best are going to be able to survive. As a case study for that EV industry, at one point China had over 100 different EV car makers, and they're all competing with each other. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that the most intense EV rivalry is probably between Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And you have a very similar thing. In what happens is you have these provinces. The inter-province rivalry is very intense, and so you can start with 100 EVs. 90 of them are going to fail because they just can't make it within their own country. But then all of a sudden, you get a case study like BYD, who has risen to the top and is the #1 EV in China. And now they're starting to really export their model. And they're so battle tested, right? They've been able to survive that intense domestic rivalry in China. Well, now they're able to go and really dominate on the international stage because, quite frankly, it's a lot easier, right? Once you've been able to get to the top in China, geez, exporting to Europe and South America, relatively easy, all things considered. Let's talk more about this with the innovation. I want to get your thoughts on what do you think about DeepSeek and how and the AI industry. And when obviously 1 month ago, we've seen DeepSeek make its debut, completely revolutionize the future of AI. Share with us your thoughts.
Yeah, but I think this was a very big rude wake-up call for the West, right? Because we have seen over the entire last 3 to 4 years, in fact, a lot of tech companies, Nvidia, you're talking about Meta, talking about Google, they've been piling on hundreds of billions of dollars to build up all this tech infrastructure in a way that they want to build the hardest, the fastest, and the most powerful AI out there. Their own version of Skynet. However, China just came in and they came up with a more elegant solution. And this solution was essentially the birth child of all the sanctions being hammered on them, the multiple chips restrictions, not being able to get latest NVIDIA chips. So they came out with their software workaround, which actually allowed you to accomplish quite a bit of AI tasks at a high level without having all the major chips out there. So if we look at the past 24 hours itself, NVIDIA lost a lot of market cap. Their stocks just totally crashed.
Right.
And that's because China has shown that you don't need to spend so much money to brute force your way out of it. There's always a simpler innovation out there. And I want to touch a bit more about China's ecosystem as well and how they're combining all these technologies together. I think a week ago, I saw an article, I think it was on the FT or South China Morning Post or something. It was about, I think, BYD using DeepSeek to create their full self-driving mechanism called the God's Eye or something. And I was so shocked about it. The speed of innovation in China is breathtaking. DeepSeek comes out and you just give it less than a month. The major car company in the world, they're going to integrate it there. And it just creates more competition for every other EV brand out there, whether it's Volkswagen, whether it's Tesla, and it's going to be very hard for them to compete, which brings us to another issue that I have. Right now, we are seeing many G7 members out there of the Western Club. They are saying that you shouldn't use DeepSeek because of data collection or the data goes to CCP or something. But I mean, if you use other solutions like ChatGPT, if the NSA wants to know what you're researching on, you'll get it.
Yeah.
So in a sense, they're just crippling, they're disadvantaging their own economies because they have an inherent certain bias against China. So I think this is not a very good feedback loop for them.
Yeah, no, I think I think what's really interesting as well is we're at a point right now in society where anything coming from China is deemed a national security threat, right? So as soon as we saw DeepSeek come out, obviously, many of the far right-wing politicians immediately said, hey, this is once again going to be another national security threat. And I think that's just almost a code language for, we can't compete. We've just been beaten. And so it's amazing kind of this hysteria that has taken over Washington but what I really like about that, Sean, is I like the fact that we've seen a lot of industry experts, really the most advanced minds in Silicon Valley have come out and said, this is an incredible gift to the world. I mean, this is really, truly open source. Again, it's something that's going to be benefiting everyone. I saw another interesting graph shared by a researcher, I believe his name is Kyle Chan, who showed this ecosystem of innovation. And it was quite fascinating because it just showed you how all of the different industries are connecting. And I think that's one thing that you see as well. For example, Huawei. Huawei is known for making, cell phones and mobile technology. Well, now they're partnering with, auto brands in China to be able to advance that technology. So you're seeing a lot of synergies between different industries, a lot of companies working together for the greater good of the country. It's a very interesting thing that happens in China. And that's something I really want our viewers to know. Obviously, you and I have had the great fortune to travel to China and experience that. And obviously, you live full time in Asia. So, we're a lot more used to these innovations in the technology. Not as much here in the United States, where we're still working on that. Not as fast forward, in developing. Quite frankly, as our Asian counterparts.
Yes, and if we look at the landscape and how it's evolving, right, it's getting quite funny, stunning, and brutal at the same time. So what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
I think just 2 weeks ago, you had an announcement from Apple that they're going to partner with Alibaba's AI to create, new iPhone solutions that can only be sold in China. So we are starting to see this big divide in technology. Even Western brands, they realize that Apple, why do I want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build up AI and compete with all the other magnificent seven out there?
Right.
Complete waste of money, right? Why don't I just tap onto China's expertise, create my own solution, and then sell it to one of the biggest growing markets out there that might even exceed the United States one day? But as a result of this, what did Trump come out over the last 3 days? He came out with an executive, I'm not so sure whether it was an order or recommendation that US companies shouldn't invest into technologies by Chinese companies. So we're already beginning to see a form of financial iron curtain coming up between the United States and China. And if this continues, if this accelerates into other forms of industries, the risk is that the US economy might get isolated more and more from cheaper innovation, cheaper technologies, while the cost of production in everything in the US just keeps going up. And I don't think that's exactly beneficial as well.
No, I think you're spot on. And, Sean, I want to talk to you a little bit about gold, because I think this is an interesting segue here, because I know that you're a very astute gold investor, a lot of experience, a lot of great videos on your YouTube channel about investing in gold. I want to get your thoughts as we're going into, obviously we're now into 2025, and we got a new president in the United States, and kind of as you're forecasting and looking forward to the future, what are you expecting in the gold industry this year? And for those that are interested in investing, kind of how are you analyzing the future of the market and these geopolitics and specifically in relation to gold?
Sure. I think the first thing we need to touch on is the massive price rally over the last 1 to 2 years, really, right? In less than 12 months, gold was like $1,800, and now we are about to crack 3,000.
Right.
Of course, when prices go on such a big run up, you tend to be quite careful, and nothing ever moves in a straight line. But if we look at the entire global situation, the amount of drivers, demand for gold, I would say over the next 5 to 10 years is still going to be bullish, right?
Right.
Let's firstly talk about the dollar sanctions, as well as the US not being able to control their fiscal spending. I think these are two very big drivers for the price of gold. At the end of the day, there are very few assets out there that is not within America's direct jurisdiction. If you have stocks in a brokerage account, worst comes to worst, the US can always take it away. They can always find out where you have your assets. However, gold is very private, it's very secret, and it's locked up in the vaults. There's even conspiracy theories about America having zero gold. That's why Trump wants to go in.
Right.
And there's so much hoo-ha about it, because gold is truly a store of value. If we shift our focus to China, we can see they're actually moving a lot of money into gold for a variety of reasons.
Right.
So let's quickly talk about the government side. It's no secret that China's deleveraging their US bond holdings. And for that, they have to find other places to store their wealth, right? As much as China likes to invest in a BRI, not every project is a great project to pour your money into, right? You still need to recover your money at the end of the day. And how much subsidies can you give your own country without being accused of, you're the great overcapacity producer on planet Earth?
Right.
So you need to take some money and store it into assets. Well, do you really want to fund the US government by buying treasury bonds after they're doing so much things to you? Not really. So you'll put it into gold. And if we look at the amount of gold holdings China has versus the US, we can see it's like 3 to 4 times the difference. The US is more, at least on official charts. But at least to me, I don't really believe it, because China is the world's biggest gold producer. That's one. And there's a lot of strict restrictions from physical gold living out of China. It's easy. It's a Hotel California, right? It's easy to come in. Gold can come in, but it's hard to come out. So all the numbers are not really adding up, which begs the question, what is China actually planning?
Right.
It's just on the government side. Now let's talk about regular average Joes, you and me. Let's say we're living in China. Why do they buy gold? Now, this is a combination of reasons. Now, firstly, in Asian cultures, including in Singapore, India, China, gold is basically true wealth, right? We've seen it around, and it holds value for generations. So there's already an embedded culture in that as well.
Right.
But if we look at the situation of China and property collapse over the last 2 years, which I think is bottoming out right now,
correct,
households really don't have much avenues to pour their money into, right? A lot of money has been put into Chinese bonds. That's why the bond yield has been going down. But frankly, you're only getting like 1-2%. It's not much, right?
Right.
And putting your money to property when confidence is so low might not really be a solution if prices keeps going down. The Chinese government is trying to stabilize it, but you don't know whether it'll be done next month or next year.
Right.
So a lot of young people, a lot of working executives, they don't really have much of a choice but to put their money into gold. It's a place of last resort. And that's why we are seeing a lot of countries, especially emerging economies like China as well, they're just stockpiling more to gold. So as this situation continues to evolve, if Trump continues persecuting his trade war, this is not good for the dollar. And unfortunately, it's good for gold. Or maybe fortunately, it's good for gold.
Right. Yeah. I think I think gold is a very interesting asset to hold. I mean, I'm certainly very bullish on gold myself. I do think it is a great storage of wealth, and I think we have this amazing relationship with the tariffs and the trade war and the dollar and how that's going. And Sean, I think today has been such an amazing conversation because I love inviting smart people that are smarter than me, that can come in and really educate us. And I really love your YouTube channel. I want to get one last question here though, before we end this. And that is, I'd like to get your thoughts on, looking forward. You're someone that studies the markets, and what are you really expecting for the U.S. economy specifically in the next 6 to 12 months? If you could give, your best guess as to that. I mean, do you think that this combination of Trump's politics and his economic policies, is this going to basically result in higher inflation, higher interest rates, and really a tougher economic times ahead? Or do you feel the opposite? Do you feel that it's, Trump's going to be able to make America great again?
Well, this is a tough one. I mean, it really depends on how Trump really goes, right? Does he go pedal to the metal?
Right.
So let's just use the base case. Right now, we are beginning to see China starting to retaliate. China's not going down without a fight.
Right.
Trump is also using a lot of harsh measures, telling Mexico, you better punish China or else we'll punish you. And how far will this rabbit hole go? Will he go to Vietnam? Will it go to EU with the same demand? Because if it does, if the whole world starts tariffing each other and everything gets into one complex mess, inflation will go up.
Right.
Interest rates will go up. The US and many economies out there, they are basically a function of interest rates and inflation. Interest rates goes too high, consumption goes down, people buy less houses, mortgage defaults, credit cards basically implode. So we could be in a situation where, I hate to say it could be a recession as well.
Right.
Then we look at what Trump is actually doing with Doge as well, is firing a lot of federal workers, which I can understand there's a lot of wastage out there, right? Look at some of the policies. Well, you're spending money on this, you're spending money on that. Even I'm rubbing my eyes.
Right.
But how far can you go along with it, right? And as the interest rates continue to stay high, this pushes up the national debt as well. So there's so many complicated parts that I think Trump understands, but maybe he's not fully appreciating as well. Now, there are some bright spots in the economy out there which might actually help the world or help their own economies and not affect the United States. Okay, one great example is China's stimulus. In the past, in 2008, when the property bubble collapsed, China actually came in and so-called saved the world in a sense, right? They bought a lot of US debt.
That's right.
They blew up their own property bubble as well. But now we are seeing a very weird decoupling between the Chinese markets, the Chinese economy, and the US economy. So just think about it. Even if China does a stimulus, President Xi launches 10, 20 trillion yuan worth of stimulus, what are the odds he's going to go out there and encourage people to buy US products? I think it's close to none.
Correct.
And even people in China, and I'm sure you might have seen instances of this where there's a bit of a nationalistic buying going on. Let's support local brands. Let's buy more Luckin coffee, maybe lay off the Starbucks for a while.
Correct.
So this kind of things is happening. And just yesterday, the last 24 hours, we saw something quite amazing. As the US stock market started to go down, S&P 500 dropped quite a bit. China's stocks were resilient.
Right.
They hardly moved. We are entering a world of true economic decoupling that we have not seen for the last 20 to 30 years. And how Trump plays this, it's going to be tough. He's either going to make the situation worse or at least maintain a slow implosion rate until somehow the United States gets back on their feet.
Yeah, what a great answer, Sean. That is fantastic. I think,
This time against China. We'll discuss this and more in this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm KJ No. These are this week's headlines. DPP leadership wants to institute military tribunals to prevent Chinese influence on Taiwan Island. In possibly the most belligerent statements to date by the ruling DPP party, Taipei called China a foreign hostile force and called for military tribunals to prosecute Beijing's influence on the Taiwan region. 17 measures were proposed, including military courts, tightening residency criteria, and audits of officials who visit the mainland. In a move that echoes what is happening to Palestinian activists in the United States, a Chinese influencer with Taiwanese residents through marriage was stripped of her residency and deported for explaining Beijing's position on Taiwan's secession in her posts. This is despite the guarantee of freedom of speech and media in the Taiwan Constitution and the DPP party platform. G7 issues belligerent statement against China on Taiwan. G7, the powerful group of ultra-capitalist former colonial powers, released a belligerent statement against China one day after Taipei's aggressive statements against China. In Canada, the foreign ministers of the G7 released a statement attacking and condemning China, Russia, and Palestine, while removing language committing the G7 to a constructive and stable relationship with China. The statement also omitted reference to their previous recognition of the One China policy. They condemned the provision of weapons and dual-use components by China, which they called a decisive enabler of Russia's war and of the reconstitution of Russia's armed forces. The Chinese embassy responded that the G7 statement ignores facts and China's solemn position, grossly interferes in China's internal affairs, and blatantly smears China, and urged the G7 to stop creating bloc confrontation and fueling tensions in the region. Chinese humanoid robots to participate in Beijing Marathon. 23 Chinese robotics manufacturers are preparing to compete in the Beijing Half Marathon on April 15th with humanoid robots. Chinese robots have demonstrated their ability to do manufacturing, household, and service tasks. They can also dance and do martial arts. The marathon will demonstrate their capacity for stable, upright, bipedal running for 23 kilometers and test the ability to endure intensive torque and mechanical stress. No Western manufacturer is entering this race. Chinese animated film Ne Jia challenges Hollywood's dominance. The Chinese animated film Ne Jia recently became the highest grossing animated film of all time and the 5th highest grossing film in cinema history. The film is now headed to European theaters. The Chinese folklore-based film, which has seen astounding box office success, is considered by many critics to be an allegory of resistance against US domination. The depictions of the oppressive forces are peppered with references to the US and the Pentagon. According to noted commentator Arnaud Bertrand, Ne Jia is potentially rewriting the rules about what messages can dominate global entertainment. Chinese researchers pioneer method to harness the body's own immune system to defeat cancer. Chinese cancer researchers at Guangxi Medical University have found a groundbreaking method to defeat cancer by harnessing the body's own immune responses. Using a genetically modified virus to mark cancer cells as foreign tissue, the method triggers a hyperacute response from the body's own immune system. This response rejects the cancer as a foreign body while leaving healthy cells untouched. Early trials have reported astounding clinical success. 90% of patients with advanced treatment-resistant cancers saw shrinkage or arrested growth of tumors. As the US discusses truce in Ukraine, many commentators have pointed out that de-escalation in Ukraine signals not military restraint, but military reprioritization, preparation for kinetic war with China. Taiwan is considered one of the most likely places where this kinetic war could be triggered. In today's China Report, we will explore recent developments in and around Taiwan that heighten tension and signal the potential for yet another war. To discuss this, we are delighted to have Benjamin Norton join us again. Ben is the editor of Geopolitical Economy Report and one of the top analysts in China. Welcome back, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Ben. Ben, there have been recent developments regarding Taiwan Island. As we noted in the headlines, Taipei referred to China as a foreign hostile force, and they called for military tribunals to prosecute Beijing's influence on the Taiwan region. They introduced 17 measures, including military courts. What is going on? Can you give us some analysis of why there is this incredible escalation right now?
Yeah, well, the stated reason is this was the 20th anniversary of the anti-secession law, but really this is part of a larger campaign that we've seen growing in recent years, provoked by the US, which is essentially trying to cause a conflict. And this could potentially even be a war, as you were mentioning earlier. I mean, there's a very real possibility of there being an actual war breaking out over this, because the US is supporting these very extreme forces in Taiwan that do not have majority among the majority of the people in Taiwan. We need to emphasize that. If you look at poll after poll, they consistently show that more than 80% of people in Taiwan want to maintain the status quo. What does that mean? It means that over time, the Chinese mainland and Taiwan will have more and more interchange. People go across the Taiwan Strait. There's more economic integration. And over time, there will be peaceful reunification. But because the majority of people want that, and they don't want this extreme agenda of secession, which polls show only has the support of a small number of people, less than 10%, the US is pushing this very extreme agenda and is essentially trying to provoke a conflict. And we've seen this happen in several ways. Of course, it's not just the Donald Trump administration. We saw this under Joe Biden. There were some very provocative actions taken, for instance, by Nancy Pelosi when she went to Taiwan and did not go to the mainland. But now what we've also seen under the Trump administration, especially in the State Department under Marco Rubio, is that the US government has taken several steps recently that are clear green lights for secessionist forces in Taiwan. Now, of course, this happens at the same time when the Trump administration is bombing Yemen brutally, and also when Trump gave the green light to Israel to restart the war in Gaza. So, you know, all the MAGA Republicans falsely claiming that Trump is in an anti-war populist.
Figured it out, huh? Revolutionary salute to our Queen, Spiritual Rising, for getting her membership to the House of Revolution. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate you doing that. Help me keep the lights on. Salute.
Populist. Well, he restarted the war in Gaza. He's expanding the war in Yemen, and he's pushing, his administration is pushing essentially for this war over Taiwan. And what we saw recently is that the Marco Rubio State Department dropped the language in which it said that it opposed Taiwan independence. Now, of course, that was just rhetorical. We've known for many decades that the US government had this policy of what's known as strategic ambiguity, where the US would publicly say that it recognizes the one China policy, that is, that there's only one China and Taiwan is part of China. This is written into international law. You go to the United Nations, there is one China, the People's Republic of China, and the UN recognizes Taiwan as a province of China. Even if you look at bodies like the International Monetary Fund, which, you know, is dominated by the West, if you go to their website and look at their economic data, it says Taiwan province of China. So on paper, the US government has recognized this in the 3 communiques that Washington signed with Beijing in 1972, 1979, and 1982. The US reaffirmed that it recognized the one China policy. Well, actually, let me take that back. The language is a little vague as well. In the Shanghai Communique signed in 1972, and when Richard Nixon went to China and normalized relations, started the normalization process, the official language of the Shanghai Communique is that the US government recognizes that both sides consider there only to be one China. So even the language has this element of strategic ambiguity. But it's been known that for decades, the US technically recognized this reality, at least formally. But of course, in recent decades, the US has had this policy of supporting separatist movements and selling more and more weapons to Taiwan. And so Marco Rubio's State Department removed that language. And then after that happened, the G7 held a meeting and the foreign ministers released a joint statement. Of course, the G7 is the group of 7 imperialist countries that colonized most of the world, North America, Europe, and Japan. And in their joint statement, they removed language that was previously used in which they expressed support for the one China policy, and they included much more aggressive anti-China rhetoric. So what we've seen is clear signs from the US government and from the G7 that were interpreted by these extremist forces in Taiwan who only have the support of a tiny percentage of elites. The vast majority of the population does not support their agenda. And they're pushing this very extreme agenda because I think they recognize that time is not on their side, that over time it's inevitable that as the mainland and Taiwan province have more and more interchange and trade, peaceful reunification will just happen organically. So what's happening is the US is trying to provoke conflict to prevent the possibility of peaceful reunification. And, they have some people in the DPP, which is the current ruling party of Taiwan, who do support this very extreme agenda. And they're willing to create military tribunals and imprison people for opposing their extremist agenda.
Yes, Ben, that was the thing that really jumped out at me. I mean, military tribunals are a legacy of Taiwan's military dictatorship. And I think it's been over a decade that they have been already outlawed. But this current DPP administration wants to bring them back. Now, we know that Taiwan Island has a long history of authoritarianism and military dictatorship. It didn't even have a presidential election until 1996. And globally, it was considered, a bad actor. It was one of an axis of rogue states, along with South Africa, Israel, Taiwan, and some Latin American dictatorships. And so there's a kind of a myth that is being put out as part of this information warfare that somehow Taiwan is a model democracy. Can you unpack that a little bit? This language, this propaganda that Taiwan is some kind of model that we should be looking up to from a historical standpoint.
Well, you're absolutely right. And what's funny is it's not just Taiwan province, which again is, according to international law, recognized as part of China. But, there are other states in East Asia that had very similar histories. South Korea was a military dictatorship until 1988, 1989. Also, Japan has only ever basically been a one-party state since after World War II. It's known as the 1955 system. There were like 3 years in which there was another party briefly in power, but basically Japan has been a one-party state posing as a so-called democracy. And, it's also funny, a quick note, is that if you look at the Asian tigers, as they're known, their economic model, there's this myth in the West that they all developed through capitalism and free markets, which is not at all true. It's the exact opposite. They all had very heavy interventionist state-led economies. In the case of South Korea, the dictatorship of Park Chung-hee nationalized all the banks. He had a state-led industrialization campaign being led by state-owned enterprises. I mean, the case is very similar in other parts of East Asia, certainly in Singapore, even in Japan before the neoliberal era. So the point is that there's this idea that East Asia, that there are these states that are all models of capitalism and democracy, which totally erases the history that until the 80s or 90s, most of them were military dictatorships and had very interventionist state-led economies that were not in any way neoliberal capitalist economies. And in the 80s and 90s, they liberalized, and then they also became, bourgeois democracies. And we've seen how undemocratic they are. In the case of South Korea, the political system is dominated by the chaebols, which are these huge corporate monopolies, and corruption is so rampant that you have, for instance, corporate executives from companies like Samsung that commit blatant crimes and they're imprisoned, and then the government releases them because Samsung is so important to the South Korean economy. So anyway, Taiwan province is very similar to that kind of situation where, if you understand that history, it makes more sense in that historical context where the US needed important allies in East Asia in order to counter the People's Republic of China and the former Soviet Union. And those allies were Taiwan province, this rogue province, where the US was supporting these separatist forces. And then, of course, South Korea and Japan. And now what we've seen is that in the past few decades, China has become the world's largest economy. Its economic growth has been incredible, without precedent in human history. And GDP measured at purchasing power parity has increased by more than 50 times. Not 50%, 50 times. And now China is the world's leading manufacturing superpower. It's responsible for about 1/3 of global manufacturing production. And what's happened is that many of these East Asian economies, including Taiwan province, but also South Korea and Japan, they've traded more and more. And as they have more economic integration with China, it's also led to at least attempts by some political forces to improve political relations. This is actually very funny because, we were talking about the history of Taiwan. When Taiwan was a military dictatorship, the ruling party was the Kuomintang, known as the KMT or the GMD. And what's funny is, historically, the Kuomintang they're the nationalists. Actually, if you go back to the beginning of the Kuomintang, they actually were allied with the communists against the Japanese imperialists. And especially in the early stages, the Chinese nationalists under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, who represented the left-wing Chinese nationalist movement, they had this popular front. But then with the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, the right wing of the Chinese nationalist movement, they took a very hard line against the Chinese communists and started killing a lot of the Chinese communists, and some of them collaborated with the Japanese and such. Anyway, the point is that, so during the time of, the Cold War, the first Cold War, the Kuomintang was a loyal U.S. ally and was very much against the mainland. But actually, one of these historical ironies that it's quite funny, in the past 20 or 30 years or so, the Kuomintang has actually become the party in Taiwan that supports better relations with the Chinese mainland because they recognize that there's only one China. Now, it's funny, they used to believe that one day that they would, launch a military offensive from Taiwan and retake the mainland. It's obviously never going to happen in a million years. They recognize that. But still, a lot of political forces in the Kuomintang want better relations with the mainland, and they have accused the DPP, which is, this US-backed party, secessionist party, they've accused them of essentially selling out their own economy, and in particular, major companies like TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which is one of the most important companies on earth. TSMC produces the majority of the most advanced semiconductors, advanced chips that are needed for high-tech technology in the world today. And Trump has made this a key part of his strategy with Taiwan, where Trump, of course, he already has put tariffs repeatedly on mainland China during his first term, and now in his second term, he's put 2 more rounds of tariffs. The average tariff rate on the mainland on China is now over 30%. It's the average tariff rate. He's paused the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, but he's continued imposing them on China. And Trump is also threatening to expand those tariffs to also touch Taiwan province. And as part of his leverage, he's trying to force TSMC to leave Taiwan and to open its factories in the United States, in particular in Arizona. TSMC has already opened factories for fabricating semiconductors. And it's not just investing billions of dollars in capital expenditure in the US, but also thousands of Taiwanese workers have gone to Arizona. They've moved with their families to work in these factories because in the US is deindustrialized. You have entire generations that don't know how to produce advanced manufactured goods. So what Trump is essentially trying to do is, while his administration, in particular Marco Rubio, is pushing this aggressive policy that could cause a war, meanwhile, Trump is essentially telling Taiwan, give us your most important companies and intellectual property because we're going to provoke a war and all that might be destroyed. So at least we can have that in the United States.
So that really signals what the US interests are, that they're certainly not interested in Taiwan's democracy or any of the human rights, quote, discourse that they're putting out, but it really is about self-interest.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's so funny hearing this rhetoric today about Taiwan being a model of democracy, because as we were just discussing, for the majority of the time after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, when the Kuomintang took over Taiwan, for the majority of the time that's been this rogue province, it has not been a bourgeois democracy. It was under a military dictatorship, and only in the past few decades they tried to rebrand, but actually it's really skin deep. We can see how thin, how superficial their commitment to so-called democracy is, because now they're threatening to bring back the military tribunals that they had for decades. As soon as the rubber hits the road, the same thing in South Korea. I mean, we saw that the current leader, Yoon Suk Yeol, you want to call him the current leader, his status is in a gray area. But the point is that he attempted a military coup. He attempted to assassinate his political rivals with the support of the U.S. And at that time, it was Joe Biden. But now Trump's in, and he's not going to even make a pretense of supporting democracy. So we see how. And then I already mentioned that Japan has been a one-party state, basically, almost without exception, since 1955. So this idea of these East Asian so-called democracies being models, it's always been propaganda used by the United States. And what's especially concerning is who are going to pay the consequences. It's going to be the people of this region. It's going to be the people of Taiwan, also the people of the Chinese mainland. If there's a war, who knows how many people would die? People from the US military aren't going to die. It's compared to Ukraine, and there are parallels, although of course there's a difference. Ukraine is not part of Russia. Taiwan is part of China. It's recognized as part of China by the United Nations. And yet the US is promoting this insane kind of secessionist policy. It would be like if China was arming secessionists in Florida who said that they refused to recognize the federal US government. They said that Florida is an independent state and that Washington is a hostile enemy. I mean, that's essentially what the US has been doing in China. But we see in Ukraine the consequences. The US told Ukraine, we're going to support you, we're your ally, as they push Ukrainians into the cannon as cannon fodder into the line of fire. And the US was willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And now we see that the US is willing to fight to the last Taiwanese.
Ben, I want to pick up on the Ukraine piece, because as the Ukraine war was progressing, the Taiwanese DPP leadership was actually very, very much in support of Ukraine. And I remember at the time—
And Israel.
And Israel, absolutely. And they said at the time that, referring to the Maidan, they said, we hope that we can have a happy ending like the Ukrainians did themselves. And so you can see this kind of very, very distorted worldview that they have. But we also know that historically, Taiwan Island, as kind of the center or the clearinghouse of global dictatorships, of global fascism, if you will, had a strong relationship to Ukraine, to Ukrainian Nazis, to Lithuanian Nazis, and also it had strong support, or it was a major backer of Latin American dictatorships. I'm talking about, for example, they had the P2 Political Warfare Cadres Academy, and this was like the School of America on steroids. That is to say, it exported death squad training to Latin America, to Asia, to Africa. It was kind of the sub-imperial contractor for US dirty wars, the wars that were so dirty that they could not actually put them on the CIA books. And so it has this like long and ugly history of subverting democracy rather than quote unquote being a model of democracy. But at the same time, you can see that the propaganda is so extreme in the West that people still believe that Taiwan is some kind of model political system. And they also seem to be buying into this language that the DPP is putting out, that Taiwan is de facto independent. Would it really be independent? I mean, everything points to the fact that it is currently, the current government is a US vassal, essentially a US client state. They openly vaunt their relationship with the now defunct NED. But what's your take on this? I mean, is there any credence to the notion that Taiwan is quote unquote de facto independent?
No, and I will respond to that in 1 second, but I just want to briefly also respond to something you mentioned, which was the World Anti-Communist League that was founded in Taiwan during the first Cold War by Chiang Kai-shek, and it was later rebranded as the World League for Freedom and Democracy. And this, as you mentioned, brought together a bunch of anti-communist groups around the world, including fascists, European fascists who had collaborated with the Third Reich, including Latin American dictatorships, and Taiwan being the original host of this. And who was on the board of that was John McCain, the old neoconservative Republican senator. So I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that history, because this idea again of Taiwan being a supposed model of democracy is so laughable if you know even the basic history of Taiwan, modern history of Taiwan. To answer your question now, so I think what we're seeing here is that the DPP they understand that they don't care about democracy, that it's a slogan that they used to justify this mission of secessionism. And originally during the first Cold War, the US didn't really care about, I mean, they still used this rhetoric of democracy and human rights, but they didn't care about openly supporting military dictatorships. By the 1980s, it was clear that the US was winning the first Cold War. And then the CIA starts to rebrand. They create the National Endowment for Democracy. And as the co-founder of the NED said famously in the Washington Post, he admitted that we do what the CIA did previously, but we do it overtly as opposed to covertly. And then the US pressured these former military dictatorships to create, bourgeois capitalist democracies in which rich people could just buy the election. So in the case of South Korea, we talked about 1988, 1989 having the first election. And by the way, the first person who won, the candidate who won the first election in South Korea was a general, a military general. So you go from an unelected military regime to an elected military regime. And then, of course, in Taiwan, you have this transition, and the US supports the DPP because they need to rebrand what's happening, because obviously everyone could see that the Kuomintang was affiliated, they were associated with far-right movements and military dictatorship. And we saw the same thing in Latin America. The US supported these military regimes in Argentina and Brazil, and the US tells them, okay, you need to Chile under Pinochet, you need to have, a bourgeois capitalist democracy. Instead of having a military general in charge, you should have a billionaire rule your country. And that's what we saw in the neoliberal era in the 1990s and 2000s. And that worked for a while because the US was the unipolar power in the world. There was no systemic challenge, large-scale, significant systemic challenge to the US. So the US could preach this idea of democracy and free markets. But now what we've seen is the situation has changed geopolitically, and there are systemic challenges led by China and BRICS and new institutions in which the Global South has protagonism. And the Global South, if you look at IMF data, for instance, the language they use is that emerging economies, low-income, formerly colonized countries now represent about 60% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity, whereas the advanced economies, as they put it, the colonizing countries that colonize most of the world, they represent 40% of global GDP PPP. And 30 years ago, it was the exact reversal. It was 60% of the advanced economies and 40% for the emerging economies. So we've seen a massive shift. And as the US has lost its hegemony, it no longer can use this idea of supporting democracy and human rights. It has to go back to the blunt, hard fist of imperialism. And this is why we've seen that, even under Biden, but especially under Trump, they've removed all reference to democracy and human rights. They said that they're getting rid of the USAID, which is actually not true. USAID was simply merged into the State Department, and it's doing its same operations covertly as opposed to overtly, because you could see everything that USAID was funding. So they're going back to the same playbook of the original First Cold War, which is supporting repression, military dictatorships, no longer even pretending to be a force of democracy and human rights, and ending their overt operations and going back to their covert operations. And this is why the DPP, which claims to be democratic and progressive in its name, is saying, yeah, we need to bring back the military tribunals because we don't have the support of the majority of the population. They did not win a majority in the election, by the way. The vote was split 3 ways, and they ended up, finagling their way into power, but they do not represent the majority of the population. So they have to resort to these kinds of repressive tactics that were used during the original Cold War. And I expect in the decades to come, we're going to see much more overt repression by the US and its allies, because in the unipolar era, it was strong enough that it didn't need to resort to that overt repression. Now it does need to go back to that.
I agree with you, Ben. I think that it's very, very clear that the world is shifting back to the mailed fist as opposed to the kind of, soft, propaganda techniques that we used before. And I think it's just right now there's this naked power, assertion of power. We see that, as you pointed out, in South Korea, the near reversion to a military dictatorship, still tremendous uncertainty about what will happen in South Korea. We certainly see that in the Philippines. We certainly see that in Taiwan Island, where they are openly talking about bringing back, as you pointed out, military tribunals. And, just coming back to the DPP itself, you pointed out that they did not have a majority. They won 40% of the vote and actually 28% of the electorate. And in any fully functioning democracy, those numbers would have led to a runoff election. But instead, they had first past the post, which is only done in 20 countries, namely the Taiwan region in South Korea and 18 other countries, which the US brands, every single one of them, as authoritarian states. And so I think it's very interesting that, the US has this, double standard around what constitutes democratic or undemocratic. We know that this is largely, a label that it decides arbitrarily. But I just want to lift up the fact that, as you pointed out, the vast majority of people do not want anything like what the DPP is proposing for them, which is to turn the country into the next Ukraine. They do not want to be turned into cannon fodder for the US empire. And it seems that the US is doing everything humanly possible to trigger this confrontation. Going back to the history a little bit, why is Taiwan so geostrategically important, both for China and the United States? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this. This is so important. So originally, after the victory of the revolution in 1949, the People's Republic actually did try to retake Taiwan. And there were attempts that failed because at that time the Chinese Navy was very weak. And of course, the U.S. was supporting the Kuomintang forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. And in the 1950s, there were more conflicts, including the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, which culminated in 1958, in which the U.S. military came very close to using nuclear weapons. This is such an important point to keep in mind. We know this because Daniel Ellsberg, the late whistleblower hero who recently passed away, he actually was supposed to disclose information about this back in the 70s, and when he disclosed information about the Vietnam War in the Pentagon Papers, but because of all the legal issues that he was caught up in, he wasn't, and also because this long story where he lost a lot of documents that he like buried at his brother's house. Long story. Anyway, he wasn't able to disclose some of this information that he had wanted to disclose then. But we now know that in the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis in the late 1950s, that Eisenhower was the one who personally rejected the question of, that is to say that the Pentagon wanted to use nuclear weapons, and they asked him if he would give them approval, and he said no. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff were pushing Eisenhower to drop nuclear bombs on the Chinese mainland over Taiwan. That's how important it was. And let's not forget that the Korean War was not just a Korean war. It was obviously an international war led by the United States, but also China played an important role in this war. And it's not a coincidence that the U.S. started this war in 1950, right after the victory of the Chinese Revolution on the 1st of October in 1949. The U.S. was hoping to prevent the spread of revolution in Korea and then use Korea as an outpost to wage counter-revolution in China, just as they were using Taiwan. And of course, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis happened a few years later. So what the U.S. was using Taiwan as a big military base to right off just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. For instance, I've gone to Fujian, the southern province in southern mainland China, and you can go to Fujian, and there are parts of what are recognized as part of Taiwan, including Jinmen, also known in English as Kinmen, which is just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. And the U.S., there were reports that the U.S. military has had troops in Kinmen or Jinmen, which is recognized as part of Taiwan, just a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland. There are U.S. troops there. There are U.S. troops training Taiwanese forces for a potential war in the future. I already talked about how the U.S. military the U.S. government has sold billions of dollars to Taiwan, despite the fact that in the third communique that the U.S. signed with China in 1982, the U.S. pledged that over time it would stop selling weapons to Taiwan. That was in 1982. Now, the language is not specific about when they will stop selling weapons, but come on, I mean, how many decades do we have to wait? Maybe they meant, okay, in the year 2300, we'll stop selling weapons. But come on, I mean, the U.S. is obviously violating the spirit of the agreement that it signed. And in terms of the position of Taiwan, I mentioned that the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to use nuclear weapons in the 1950s. They had nuclear weapons stored on Taiwan. This was disclosed also by the National Security Archive in Washington, which is a great think tank and research institution. And they got access to documents that show from the U.S. government that they had nuclear weapons stored there. And when Richard Nixon went to China, the mainland in 1972, one of the stipulations was that the U.S., in order for China to agree to normalize relations with the United States, the U.S. had to agree to recognize the One China policy, and the U.S. had to agree to close its military base on Taiwan and to remove nuclear weapons, which is what they did. So another reason, of course, that the U.S. wants control over Taiwan, and this gets to this issue. Sorry, I guess I never really directly answered your question earlier about whether or not Taiwan is truly independent. No, it's not de facto independent. and it won't be de facto independent. I already talked about how, according to international law, it's not independent. It's recognized as part of China. But also, when you talk about independence, if these extremist forces in Taiwan were to declare, de jure independence, not just de facto as they claim, but if they were to say legally we consider ourselves independent, obviously that would cause a war. But in addition to that, they would not be independent because they would essentially be a colony of the United States. And this is why people
military base, yes, a U.S. military base.
Yeah, this is why people who, people on the left who have this rhetoric of supporting the sovereignty and the self-determination of the people of Taiwan, you cannot have self-determination when the U.S. government controls you. This is the whole thing with Ukraine as well. I mean, what Trump is doing right now is ironically trying to impose an unequal treaty on Ukraine. Even the Telegraph, the mainstream British newspaper, referred to what Trump's doing to Ukraine as economic colonialism that will give the U.S. control over Ukraine's natural resources and the U.S. government control over what the Ukrainian government spends with the money that it gets from exporting its natural resources. The same thing with Taiwan. If these forces were to declare literal independence and not what they call de facto independence, the U.S. government would control them. I mean, it already basically tries to control them. And what the U.S. wants is to build a new military base on Taiwan to prepare for a war with the mainland and to put nuclear weapons on Taiwan. Can you imagine if China wanted to put nuclear weapons in like Florida or something, or California? There was a big California secessionist movement. Imagine China supported California secessionists and they declared themselves independent. And then China built a big military base in California and then put nuclear weapons in California. What would be the response of the U.S. government?
I think that's pretty clear what it would be. It would be immediate. I think, yeah. But, just kind of to add to what you've already said, I think there's pretty clear evidence that there are at least several hundred Green Beret on Jinmen Island. And Jinmen Island, as you point out, is swimming distance. It's 3 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland, which is to say that the United States has sent a message to China that when war happens, you are not even going to get out of the end zone, that we put the tripwire so close to your nose that you're not even going to be able to play the ball onto the court. And at the same time, we see the constant provocations along the Taiwan Strait, sending US and NATO vessels right through the Taiwan Strait in these belligerent naval maneuvers. They call them freedom of operations. No such thing exists under naval law. But once again, to use the sports metaphor, it's like constantly driving into the paint over and over again, trying to draw a foul. And I think all of this is grounded with also the US preparations, legislative preparations that have been in place for many, many years now. The Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act essentially was a plan to micromanage both Taiwan's military, to micro-audit and micromanage it, as well as its political affairs, in order to turn the entire country into, as many people have said, an unsinkable aircraft carrier that is simply a US pawn in its continued escalation and provocation against China. Coming back to the nuclear dimension, we know that there were the single integrated operational plans, the PSYOP nuclear plans. And during the late 50s and 60s, the plan was not only to destroy the Soviet Union in a preemptive strike, but as they were waging nuclear war with the Soviet Union, they would simply destroy 70% of China City just for the heck of it, right? It's a twofer. China was already having difficulties with the Soviet Union at the time. The Sino-Soviet split was already happening, but the US plans at the time were simply to wipe out China, destroy 70% of its cities just because it could. And so I think that really heightens the strategic risk that Taiwan, quote unquote, independence poses to China, that it is not independence. It's not independence of the sort. In fact, Taiwan has never really been independent. It's simply been a US para-colony, sometimes more obviously and more, demonstratively and aggressively a US para-colony. And then sometimes it's being used as a hedge and as a kind of a subcontractor for US dirty wars and US political actions that it wants to keep off the books. And now it seems like it's coming back directly into becoming a US military base and that, unsinkable aircraft carrier. So I think it's pretty clear that, the threat is really from the United States using Taiwan as its, forward base. But still, there is such an extraordinary trope, that it is China that is threatening Taiwan, and that Taiwan is some kind of independent and separate culture that the Chinese are trying to infringe upon. Can you say a little bit about that? Is Taiwan a separate? Is Taiwan not Chinese? Is this actually a credible statement to make?
Well, this is what the DPP has tried to do, is try to create this idea of a separate Taiwanese culture. I mean, we were talking about the history of the Kuomintang and the many problems with the Kuomintang. But again, this is one of these historic ironies, right? Which is that historically, because the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek and still today had this idea that there is only one China and that they thought that they were going to be able to take the mainland. And now, the Kuomintang leadership today is more lucid and realizes it's never going to happen. But they still recognize that they're part of China. And when they say that they're part of China, it's not just political, it's also cultural and civilizational. They recognize that Taiwan has been historically part of China for many centuries, well before the revolution of 1949. I mean, you can go back to the Qing dynasty, and I'm certainly not a defender and a fan of the Qing dynasty, but go back and look at their maps. I mean, before the United States existed as a country, Taiwan was part of China. And yet now the US is saying, Taiwan's not part of, it's nonsense. At least, actually, legally, formally, the US government's not saying that, but some US politicians are saying that because, again, this is the whole strategic ambiguity. But, I mean, Taiwan has been part of China for many centuries. And this idea that Taiwan is a separate culture is a very new political phenomenon. And you could say, fine, every culture is politically constructed. Okay, fine. But it's part of a political project by the DPP with support from the US government and funding from US government agencies and institutions like the NED and USAID. They've cultivated these groups for the past few decades to try to, as part of a kind of culture war, to support the political war and the secessionist movement.
And they've also done it through the schools. The entire school curriculum has been changed so that China is separated out from, quote unquote, the history of the Taiwan region. I've been told that Chinese history now is a separate subject, like world history, rather than part of the history of the region itself. But I've always been struck by the fact that, people talk about the Taiwanese dialect, which is called Minnanhua. And Minnanhua is actually the language of the Fujian region in mainland China. And of course, the river Min is a river in China. Minnan means south of the river Min. And so it's essentially Fujian language, which they're claiming is, it's just another dialect of Chinese. And I think the other thing which is so very striking is if you go to the National Museum on Taiwan Island, it has 700,000 pieces of Chinese art. In fact, it is the largest collection of Chinese art in the world. And so there seems to be some, deep contradictions inside their, ideological campaign.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick note. You raised great points, and especially about the dialect issue, by the way. For people who don't know, people often conflate Mandarin and Chinese, but Mandarin is, I mean, Chinese is very broad. There are many different Chinese dialects and internal languages that are not mutually intelligible inside the mainland. There are many. I mean, so China, the mainland has 56 recognized ethnic groups, including the Han and 55 minorities. And there are many different languages recognized. And in each different province in the autonomous regions, they have, on all the public signs, they have their own language, and then they have Mandarin. And as you mentioned, I mean, Taiwan's dialect is basically identical to that of Fujian, the southern province in the mainland. And also, the Mandarin spoken by the majority of people in Taiwan is completely intelligible to people from the mainland. I mean, they constantly speak with each other. I just did an interview a few days ago with someone from Taiwan and someone from the mainland. We were speaking in English. My Chinese isn't that good enough yet, but they were speaking to each other in Chinese before the interview started. And, this reminds me of another quick point, which is about Hong Kong, because we've seen similar propaganda about Hong Kong, except, Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997, and Macau was a Portuguese colony until 1999. And there's this part of the propaganda used by the DPP and separatists in Taiwan is they have this idea that we can never be, peacefully reunified with the mainland because they will repress us and won't allow us to have our own system. But that actually ignores the precedents. Look at what happened in Hong Kong and look what happened in Macau. There's been all this propaganda about Hong Kong, but Hong Kong still has its own system as part of what's known as one country, two systems. So Hong Kong still has its own kind of neoliberal capitalist system. And ironically, one of the reasons that there were so many protests in Hong Kong is because of the very high cost of living and real estate in Hong Kong, in no small part due to the capitalist policies of the Hong Kong authorities. And in the case of Macau, it's notorious for having legal gambling and having casinos and such. I mean, they still, the Chinese authorities still respect this idea of one country and two systems. And when Taiwan is reintegrated into China, which is inevitable, it's going to happen, they're probably going to have some kind of similar system, similar policy of one country and two systems. So this idea that like the mainland is just going to repress, even if people in Taiwan want to say that they have their own independent identity and culture, like maybe people in Hong Kong will say, there are differences in Hong Kong because of the history of British colonialism. A lot of people speak English and they speak Chinese. Okay, fine. They can have their own unique cultural tradition and dialect and such in Taiwan like they do in Hong Kong, but they're still going to be part of China. So one country, two systems.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight that, China is a civilizational state consisting of many cultures, of which, Fujianese culture is just one. And it also has multiple autonomous regions and, of course, many systems inside its own national polity. I wanted to highlight also, there's a discourse among the DPP secessionist types that tries to claim indigeneity as a part of its claim to sovereignty, which is very, very odd because the indigenous people of Taiwan Island, they're about 2.3% of the population, actually support good relations with China and by and large vastly support the KMT, which is in favor of good relations, if not reunification of some sort with China. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that in China, the ethnic minorities are 8% of the population, and they possess 45% of the land, of the territory of mainland China, whereas on Taiwan Island, they're 2.3% of the population, and they have absolutely no possession of their own lands. In fact, they are a highly dispossessed and oppressed minority that really has no rights other than a kind of Disneyfied fetishization, which the DPP uses as some kind of claim to sovereignty, which is completely belied by the beliefs and the politics of the indigenous themselves. I know we're getting into some, very kind of granular pieces, but I was curious whether you had any comments about that too.
No, you raised exactly the point that I would have made. Great point. And this is, again, one of these funny historical ironies where the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist party, and Chiang Kai-shek were the ones who repressed the ethnic minorities in Taiwan because they had this idea of a Chinese nation, right? It's the whole idea of the nationalist party. And now it's the DPP, the rivals of the Kuomintang, that are bringing back this idea of saying that we represent indigenous people, but actually they're the descendants of the people who displaced the indigenous people. And now they're the ones saying, oh, we're indigenous. I mean, it's like, people in the US who are 1/20th Native American, and then they claim Native American heritage. Meanwhile, the actual Native Americans are being repressed by the US government. Similarly, in Taiwan, you have these authorities saying, we're indigenous. Well, they continue to repress the actual indigenous people, which, as you point out, the indigenous people are much more favorable toward the mainland, largely because in the mainland, they have this policy of strongly supporting the rights and the autonomy of different ethnic groups. I mentioned that according to mainland Chinese law, it officially says that there are 56 recognized ethnic groups, one of which is the Han, the majority, and there are 55 officially recognized ethnic minorities, and several of them have their own autonomous regions. And I've been to some of them. You can go and you see the public buildings and the signs and such, and they have their own language and they have Mandarin. Even here in Beijing, where I'm speaking to you from now, you can go, for instance, there are different regions, different provinces and regions that have like their own buildings and such, and you can see that they have their language and also Mandarin. So ironically, the mainland treats the minorities much better than the Taiwanese authorities, who claim to be descendants of the indigenous people, which they're actually not.
Yes. So the ironies just seem endless. I think perhaps cynicism is a better word. But anyway,
yeah.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late for you. You've had a long day. Thank you.
Go follow me.